The hearing will come to order. Welcome to the Committee on the Budget's hearing on the President's fiscal year 2018 budget. Today we will hear testimony from the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, the Honorable Mick Mulvaney. Good morning once again to everyone, and thank you for being here today. I want to especially thank Mr. Mulvaney, the Director of the White House Office on Management and Budget, for being here today to discuss the President's budget and spending priorities, and we look forward to hearing his remarks. While Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse, the federal budget is a collaborative process. The administration, this committee, and our counterparts in the Senate work together to build a budget that reflects our unified priorities. For the last 8 years, we've seen budgets from the White House that reflect the status quo of more spending, more regulation, and never even trying to achieve balance. Over the same time period, economic stagnation led Congressional Budget Office to continually downgrade their projections for economic growth. And what's the result of more spending, more regulation, and slower economic growth? It's a large debt burden on the future generation of Americans, a burden that reflects a moral failure to face head-on our challenges. This administration and this committee agree wholeheartedly on our responsibility to improve our country's fiscal situation and put us on the path to a balanced budget that allows us to start paying down our national debt. Our friends across the aisle will no doubt defend the status quo of the Obama years, where the national debt increased by over $9 trillion, the largest increase of any presidency. Their solutions, which are to simply keep on doing what we've been doing, are not only unsustainable, they are an abdication of our responsibility to current and future generations. Our fiscal situation is not just problematic, it is dire. According to the CBO, the federal debt held by the public, which currently stands at 77% of gross domestic product, will rise to 150% of GDP in the next 30 years if nothing is done. Over the same period of time, deficits will rise from 2.9% of GDP to 9.8% of GDP. These are levels of debt and deficits that have never been seen like this before in American history, and are well beyond what the economists predict would result in a crisis. The CBO says that maintaining the status quo would, and I quote, reduce national saving and income in long term, increase the government's interest cost, putting more pressure on the rest of the budget, limit lawmakers' ability to respond to unforeseen events, and increase the likelihood of a fiscal crisis, end quote. Let me repeat a piece of that, the last line. Quote, doing nothing and continuing the status quo will result in a fiscal crisis. Put simply, the status quo is not an option. And this committee and this administration are committed to building a federal budget that begins to deal with our out-of-control spending, incentivizes economic growth through tax and regulatory reform, and make sure that the government works for the people, not for the bureaucrats. Our committee and this administration also agree on the commitment of funding our military. The threats to our national and homeland security continue to grow. The previous administration left the world less safe and secure with growing threats from all corners of the globe. Ensuring the safety and security of our nation is our first and foremost responsibility of the federal government, and we should give our men and women in uniform the resources they need to complete their mission. I applaud the President for making our national defense a top priority once again. As our committee and our Senate counterparts go through this process of building our budget resolution, the input from the administration officials, such as Mr. Mulvaney, is an invaluable resource to provide information, background, and details on the goals of President Trump. Balancing the budget over 10 years presents major challenges, but also a great opportunity. And for the first time since I've been serving on the Budget Committee, we have a president who is willing to take action to reform government and to get our fiscal house in order. Our budget resolution is no longer a vision document, it is a blueprint for building the better America we've promised our constituents for years. It is our opportunity to show our real progress in limiting the size and the scope of government, ensuring our children and grandchildren aren't burdened by our unsustainable levels of debt, and persevering for a safe and strong America. I know that working together we can find the right solutions for the American people. Thank you, and with that, Ms. Jibholt, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Black, as Vice Ranking Member, and until Ranking Member John Yarmouth, let me read this statement. Director Mulvaney, it's good to see you. Congratulations on your new position. As you know, this hearing traditionally gives the American people the chance to see the differences between the priorities and values of our two parties. Those contrasts will be made absolutely clear today. The Trump budget is shockingly extreme, the antithesis of what the American people have said they want from their government. It leaves no question of what this administration values: greater gains for millionaires and corporations at the expense of American families, economic progress, and our national security. Yes, the president's budget is a betrayal, a line-by-line tally of broken promises. But above all, it's a shattering of dreams and the loss of hope and opportunity for millions of families. This budget starts by taking away health care, then food, then housing, then education, then job opportunities. For nearly every American family struggling to get ahead, this budget makes that much harder, if not impossible. The level of cuts to investments that Americans need is astonishing and frankly immoral. This budget cuts non-defense discretionary funding for 2018 by a massive $54 billion from the already austerity-level spending cap. Then the budget goes haywire, cutting NDD more and more each year until 2027, when investments are decimated by nearly 30%. And that's without adjusting for inflation. A 30% cut in non-defense discretionary spending, which includes homeland security, education, medical research, veterans health care, transportation, and much more, represents a total disinvestment in our nation and a complete departure from every standard of responsible governing. But it gets worse. We know that at least 24 million Americans would lose health care coverage because this budget includes the Republican health care repeal bill. This budget cuts Medicaid by another $600 billion. That's a total cut of $1.4 trillion to a program that is the only source of health care for tens of thousands of individuals in every single congressional district in the country. The vast majority of those people are children, seniors in nursing homes, and the disabled. This budget actually targets help for people with disabilities, cutting Social Security disability insurance by as much as $72 billion, despite the president's pledge to not touch Social Security at all. And it cuts $193 billion from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This is the program that makes sure our poorest families have at least some chance to put a meal on the table. It provides just $1.42 per person per meal, again, mainly to seniors, children, and the disabled. The president's budget eliminates or eviscerates 14 education and arts programs, makes it harder for Americans to get needed skills to compete for jobs, guts investments in rural and urban communities, jeopardizes the safety of our food, air, and water, and leaves roads and bridges to crumble. The Trump administration makes all these cuts for one simple and frankly disgraceful reason: to hide the fact that their huge tax breaks for millionaires, corporations, and special interests will explode the debt. And they even do that in a dishonest way. This budget relies on absurd economic projections and pretend revenues that no credible economist would validate. It provides no real information on tax reform other than to claim that it's revenue neutral. I guess this is the president's believe me part of his budget. With all due respect, we aren't going to take the president's word for it, particularly when no one else will. And Ranking Member Yarmouth, would you like me to turn it back over to you or finish your statement?
Okay, so let me go ahead and finish this. We have been down this road before more than once, and I know you believe it with all your heart, but you're wrong. Tax cuts for corporations and the wealthiest Americans do not pay for themselves. They drive up our deficits and rob our country of needed investments, and that is the truth. And it's also true that we can't trust a budget that sets up false choices. This budget increases 2018 defense spending by $54 billion while cutting NDD by the same amount. We don't have to choose between updating tanks or textbooks, and we should not be pitting teachers against soldiers. To strengthen our national security, we have to ensure that our military and American families have the tools needed for success. And that is our responsibility, to invest in the future of American families and help grow our economy. Education, healthcare, job training, innovation, infrastructure, programs that help individuals with nowhere left to turn, and a tax code that helps families get ahead. Those are American priorities, and they should be the priorities of this Congress and this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jayapal, and welcome. I know that there was a little confusion in the times, so welcome, Ranking Member Mr. Yarmouth. I look forward to hearing discussion a little bit later. So now I would thank you. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, I ask that you submit them for the record. And I would now like to recognize Director Mick Mulvaney, and thank you for taking your time to come here today. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. And you will now have 10 minutes to deliver your oral remarks, and you may begin when you're ready.
Chairman Black, thank you so much for having me. Ranking Member Ms. Jayapal, thank you for the opening statements. Ranking Member Yarmouth, thank you for making it. So I wouldn't dream of doing this without you. So thank you all for having me here today. It's really an honor to be here, to be back in this committee. For those of you who I don't know, I served in this committee for 2 years, and it is an honor and a privilege to be here on behalf of the Trump administration. Mr. Lewis, welcome. You're sitting in my chair. So it's an honor to be here. I'm not going to read my opening statement. I'm going to make a couple comments and we get right to the question and answers. When we looked at the budget for the very first time, I picked it up on Friday, the new Foundation for American Greatness. I spent most of the weekend, as you can imagine, reading it. And as I went through it, it struck me that we could have come up with a different title. And the title could have been The Taxpayer First Budget. Because the first time, in my memory at least, this is a budget that was written from the perspective of the people who actually pay for the government. And we went line by line through what this government does and asked ourselves, can we justify this to the folks who are actually paying for it? If I'm going to take money from Mr. Diaz-Balart in taxes and I'm going to spend it on a program, can I justify to him actually spending that money? If I'm going to take money from you, Ms. Schakowsky, and do the same thing, can I justify it to you? Can I look you in the eye and say, I need to take this money from you in order to give it to a disabled veteran? And I think that I can. I'm not sure I could look at Mr. Woodall and say, Mr. Woodall, I need to take some of your money so that I can give it to a program that is completely ineffective, doesn't help anybody, and is rife with waste, fraud, and abuse. And that's the perspective that we brought to this budget from the very beginning. And maybe that's what's new about the new Foundation for American Greatness budget. The other thing that's new, by the way, is that it does balance. And for those of you who've been here for a long time, you know that it's been a long time since the President's budget has balanced. It certainly hasn't happened since I arrived in Washington, D.C. in 2010. Someone mentioned on the news today this is a moral document, and it is. And here's the moral side of it. If I take money from you and I have no intention of ever giving it back, that is not debt, that is theft. If I take money from you with an intention to pay it back, and I can show you how I intend to pay it back, that is debt. And what we've been doing for too long, both parties, by the way, in this city, have been taking money from people without laying out a plan for how we're ever going to pay it back. And we start doing that with this budget. This budget does balance within the 10-year window, something that is completely new in this town. What's the foundation? The foundation for the plan is 3% growth. In fact, that is Trumponomics. People ask me, you're the budget director, what do you think about Trumponomics? Trumponomics is whatever can get us to 3% growth. And I can assure you, when I am in the Oval Office with the President and we're talking about trade policy, we're talking about energy policy, we talk about tax policy, we talk about health care reform, we talk about budgets, we're trying to figure out a way to get to 3% growth. I have news for you, both parties. if we do not get to 3% growth, it is unlikely we'll ever balance the budget again. And that is not a plan. That is not a plan for the future. That is not moral, to continue to take money from people without having a plan to pay it back. So we do everything we can to try and get to 3% growth. I look forward to the questions today about how we do that. We do all of this, by the way, and still fund the President's priorities. You've heard it by now. We wanted more money for national security, border security, law enforcement, veterans, school choice, even paid parental leave. For the first time ever, President Trump, the first president of either party, is proposing a national paid parental leave program. We have $20 billion in this budget to do that. We don't touch Social Security and Medicare, following through on his campaign promises. And we're able to do all of that and still balance. Why? Because what we did here is try and change the way that Washington looks at spending. We no longer want to measure compassion by the number of programs that we have or the number of people that are on those programs. We want to measure compassion, true compassion, by the number of people we help to get off of those programs. We don't want to measure our commitment to the country by the amount of money that we spend, but instead on the number of people that we help get off of these programs and get back in charge of their own lives. That is what we think makes this the American greatness budget, because we're going to try and get the country back to where we have a healthy economy, people are working again, people are optimistic about the country again. I remind you, if you're under the age of 30, you have never had a job as an adult in a healthy American economy. And a healthy American economy is very, very different than what you've seen for the last 10 years. And the dynamism and the optimism that comes from that is what this administration is about. It's what this president promised. It's what we're going to do everything in our power to deliver, and the budget is a start to that. So with that, Madam Chairman, again, thank you for having me today. I look forward to the questions and in explaining the budget to the members.
Thank you, Mr. Director, and I look forward to the conversation, and thank you for yielding back those 5 minutes, and our members will have more time and opportunity to ask you questions. And so now we will begin the question and answer period, and I'm going to begin with the first question. You mentioned during your opening comments about a moral obligation of balancing the budget, and around here in Washington, you'll hear some folks say this is just kind of a quaint acronym, that we should balance a budget, that somehow that would not be something that would be very important. And you mentioned about it being a moral obligation. I certainly, as a mother and a grandmother, and hopefully a grandmother, great-grandmother someday, do feel that it is our moral obligation to make sure that we leave a strong country without huge deficits for our children and grandchildren. And so will you talk a little bit more about your view on the fiscal and economic well-being and what will happen if we continue these chronic budget deficits and ever-rising debt on the moral issue for the future generations?
I'll approach it this way. Thank you, Chairman Black. Everybody around this table owes the federal government $60,000. I have 3 17-year-olds. Okay? They're not even out of school yet, and they owe this government $60,000 each. Every man, woman, and child in this room owes the federal government $60,000. I'm not sure if they know that. I'm not sure if we've done a good job as both parties of explaining to people what government truly costs. In fact, I happen to believe we've done a really good job of hiding the cost, the true cost of government from the American people. Yeah. I don't believe that people are willing to pay for as much government as they have. And I don't think that we've been entirely honest with them for about the last 40 years on what government truly costs. And I do think there's a moral imperative to tell them, to say, look, this is how much it costs, and this is how much we have to take from you in order to do this. Do you really want us to take from you that much money? Or do you want us to try and find a way to balance and to spend less? And balance is something that it seems foreign in this city, which completely stuns me. I don't know how many of you used to be on the state legislatures. I was. I know that Governor Sanford was when he was my governor in South Carolina. But a balanced budget was the ordinary course of business for just about everybody in the world except this body. States have to do it. Families have to do it. Businesses have to do it. I mean, my goodness, my church has to balance its budget or else they cease to function. And I think there's a disconnect between the American people and the government when we don't lay out a path to balance. When you talk about the financial impact of that, Madam Chairman, what you look at as we go forward is every single year we talk about more and more of our money going to pay interest payments on the debt. And I don't know the exact numbers, but at some point in the very near future, we expect to be paying more money for debt than we do for defense. And that worries me. I was in, not this room because this is a temporary room, but I was in the old budget room my very first year when I saw the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff sit in front of this committee and say that he thought the greatest threat to this nation was the national debt. Great countries are not destroyed from without. They rot from within. And that debt, that crushing debt that we have on every man, woman, and child is part of that rot, and that's what we're trying to address in a very candid, open, and honest way in this budget.
And I do appreciate that. And I appreciate you putting it in a context as well, that we would look at our students in high schools and say to them, would you like to have a $60,000 car, or would you like to just pay your share of the debt to the federal government? So I appreciate putting it in a real context where folks understand that when we talk about trillions of dollars, I know even before I came here to Congress and serving in the state legislature, we talked about millions and billions. We don't talk about trillions of dollars as state legislators. And honestly, you sometimes think that's a fictional amount because people cannot wrap their heads around trillions of dollars. But when you put it in a real context of your share of that is $60,000 and you're really, at the end of the day, not paying off even the debt that we're continuing to build up. Along with that, I do want to say it's gratifying to see that the administration is taking a stand on some federal entitlement programs and reforming them. Do you consider entitlement reform an indispensable part of reaching that balanced budget, especially as we look at how we're only spending 1/3 of our total dollars on everyday spending, and the rest of it is over in that column with the debt and the entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and the other entitlement programs. So do you consider that an indispensable part of what we must be doing? And along with that, do you agree that even if we weren't facing a fiscal crisis, that reforming these entitlement programs really is the right thing to do?
Let me answer it this way, Chairman. I don't believe it's possible. In fact, I know it's not possible to balance the budget solely using the discretionary portion of the budget. There have been years that I was here, 2010, 2011, I believe, where we could have taken discretionary spending to at or near zero, and we still would have had a deficit. In our budget, we do address mandatory spending, what some people call entitlement spending, but we do not address the two that the President simply didn't want to touch, which was Social Security, retirement, and Medicare. I've told the story many times. I actually sat across the desk from him in the Oval Office with my list of mandatory reforms, and at the end of, I think we had 4 meetings on it, he would go, yes, yes, no, 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 and the no's were all Social Security, retirement, and Medicare. And when I pressed him on that, he said, look, I made a promise. I made a promise to people that I would not touch those, and we didn't. And I'll be perfectly frank with you and candid. I didn't think we could balance the budget. And that's why I was extraordinarily impressed with my team when they were able to figure out a way to balance the budget without touching those things. I will tell you it's probably the last time we could do that. It will be very difficult in the future to do that because of the role that those programs do play in our future spending. But I was excited to be able to keep the President's promise. By the way, the budget is nothing more than a collection of his promises. That's how we wrote it. If he said he wanted to spend more money on something during the campaign, we spend more money here. If he said he wanted to spend less, we spent less here. He said he wanted to add to defense, he wanted to add to border security, wanted to add to school choice and Veterans Affairs, but didn't want to add to the deficit in year one. That's the framework for the budget. But to your larger point, yeah, you cannot address our long-term drivers of our debt without looking at the mandatory side of the budget. It's 3/4 of what we spend, going to 80% in the near future. So yeah, you would be hard-pressed to be able to balance the budget without looking at mandatory spending.
And along those lines, and I'll conclude my questions here, but along those lines we sat and talked privately about some of the ideas that you had, and you shared with me that we don't want to hurt people who really need the kinds of services that we want to be sure they get. In other words, we don't want somebody who is unable to afford their heat and air conditioning to go without getting those services. But there are wastes in these programs, and I think that's important that we talk about the wastes in the programs at the same time acknowledging that we're not heartless people. We want to make sure we take care of people, but we also want to make sure our dollars are well spent. Would you give an example of it, just in the LIHEAP program, about how there are wastes that we need to make sure that we're cleaning up?
And I know it fits a certain narrative that our party doesn't care about poor people, and that seems to always filter out during budget time. In fact, it filters out all the time. I believe in the social safety net. I really do. I actually think that it helps us get to that 3% growth, and I've made that exact argument to the President, that a healthy social safety net gives people that confidence that we need them to have in order to take risks, in order to start your own business, in order to go out on your own, to bring the sort of dynamism that we need into the economy to get 3% growth, and that a healthy safety net is part and parcel of that. And we can absolutely afford to do that for folks who really need it. Part of the difficulty, I think, and we'll talk about this, I know, as we go through the various programs, though, is are there folks who are on these programs who shouldn't be? And again, when we have a chance to go into more detail, I will answer your specific question about LIHEAP. 11,000 dead people got this benefit a few years ago. Dead people. One of your states, I can't remember which one it is, has a requirement that they approve 3/4 of the applications, regardless of merit. When you look at that through the perspective of the folks who pay for the program, it's an entirely different perspective than, oh my goodness, you're going to put people out on the street, or people are going to freeze to death. No, they aren't. We are not going to kick any deserving person off of any meaningful program. We want to help people just as much as you do. Republicans care about poor people as much as Democrats, just the same as we care about clean air and healthy drinking water. But we look at it from a different perspective, which is to balance those who receive the benefits with the folks who pay for the benefits. And when you show me a program where 11,000 dead people are getting benefits, I have a problem with that, because I think taxpayers would as well. I look forward to having those conversations as we move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Director. And I now recognize Mr. Yarmouth for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Black and Director Mulvaney. Nice to see you. Welcome back to the committee, and thank you for your work. The first thing I want to do today is thank you, because one of the things that I think you've done by submitting this budget to Congress is highlight some incredibly important, vital programs that and investments that the federal government makes that help working families throughout this country and that support much of the economy in this country. You know, it's one thing to say, well, we can do without CPB, we can do without NEA, we can do without NEH, we can do without CDBG, and people just hear initials and they don't really know what we're talking about. But when they say, would you like arts programs in your community? Would you like historical displays in your rural community? Would you like Meals on Wheels to help your seniors survive? Then they understand that these are critical programs that are worthy of government investment. So I thank you for highlighting that for the American people. And I just have to respond to one thing. That guy who's deciding would decide whether to buy a $60,000 car or pay $60,000 to the government, I wonder what he would answer if you said you can have a $60,000 car or your senior parent can come live with you, because the money that would put her or him in a nursing home that is paid for by Medicaid is not going to be available to you. I think you probably get a little bit different perspective on that. And Mr. Mulvaney, you said on several occasions that you could not ask a single mother, I think you said in Detroit, but it obviously doesn't matter where that single mother would be, whether she would be willing to pay for her share of public television or NEA and so forth. And I would say most single mothers that I would know, if you asked them whether they would pay $1 for $1 a year for children's programming, or would they rather pay $2,000 a year for their share of the defense budget, they wouldn't have any problem paying that $1 for children's programming, but they might balk a little bit at a $2,000 payment for defense. So what we're really talking about in this budget, I think, is this is the age-old guns versus butter argument, and I think we'll continue to have that debate, and I think it's really unfortunate in a way, and I thank Ms. Jayapal for that impressive rendition of my opening statement, but this really is pitting one against the other, this budget. That's what it does. It pits defense investment against investment in everything else. And that's a frightening concept, I think, for this country, if we have to ignore the portion of the federal budget that invests in people, whether it's job training, education, important medical research and other innovation, or whether we buy guns. But that's what we're being asked to do in this budget. So, you've justified many of the cuts in this budget by saying that there's no evidence to prove that these programs actually work. For example, you've suggested that Meals on Wheels doesn't work. I would think that just by nature of the fact that you're keeping people alive by feeding them is pretty good evidence. But beyond the question of morality of providing meals to seniors, there's abundant evidence that it does work, including evidence that even small increases in that program pay dividends in the form of lower Medicaid spending. Granted, there are many other programs where the evidence may be more nuanced, but that doesn't mean the programs don't work and should be eliminated, pulling the rug out from working people, children, and the elderly who need them. So if direct empirical evidence that something works is the only standard for funding, then what is the direct empirical evidence that an additional submarine or one more F-35 increases our security? That kind of evidence would be difficult, if not impossible, to produce. Does that mean we shouldn't buy submarines or F-35s? No, of course not. We rely on a comprehensive body of information, including opinions of our military leaders and national security and foreign policy experts, to make those decisions. So the administration is asking for an additional $54 billion above the caps, and there's been plenty of evidence and reports indicating waste and mismanagement at the Pentagon, including it's the only agency that can't pass an audit. There have been hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons system cost overruns, reports of significant bloat in the overhead. The Defense Business Board concluded $125 billion in savings over 5 years could be achieved. GAO has identified a myriad of high-risk management areas in DoD's business operations. And just this past weekend, the Washington Post reported on gross overpricing of fuel in DoD, which created billions of dollars in reserve cash for the Pentagon to spend on new priorities. So my question to you is, how have these reports of mismanagement and waste factored in the administration's decision to add $54 billion for national defense?
A couple of different things to that, Ranking Member Yarmouth, and thank you for the questions. On the DoD, a couple of things. I'm just as interested as you are, I believe, in waste at the Department of Defense, and I'm happy to announce, once I got over to OMB, I started asking questions about what we were going to do about that, and I'm told by the DoD, in fact, I think they just filed a confirmation of this a couple of weeks ago, that they intend to be fully audit ready by September of this year. That's pursuant to law. I think they're required to hit that deadline. They told us they're ready to hit that deadline. In fact, I think certain subparts of the department are already ready. But I do look forward to continuing to work on those with you. Regarding Meals on Wheels, I'll come back to that for a second. Ed, you know I have no intention to embarrass you because you are a friend of mine, but I do believe that the article that you read about that has been withdrawn by the Washington Post. We never said that Meals on Wheels was ineffective. As is too often the case, the story got printed like this and the redaction got printed like this.
Okay.
But let's talk about the Meals on Wheels because we don't reduce it. Okay, most of that is funded through, it's an HHS program. No, ma'am, CDBG is not. The primary funding for Meals on Wheels comes through the Senior Nutrition Services. I believe that's at HHS. It could be HUD. I lose track of the alphabet soup. There's no reduction in that program. Yes, we do cut the CDBG program, but that is a program that accounts for less than 1%, and it's optional by the states. We block grants to the states, and some states do choose to use some of that money for Meals on Wheels, but that funding accounts for 1% of total Meals on Wheels. So I just wanted to clarify that. Regarding the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, look, I mean, my mom tells me I saw the very first Sesame Street. Okay? In fact, I was curious that there's a printer in the back room here with Bert's picture on it. They've evidently named the printers here, Ernie and Bert. It's a for-profit corporation, and it does extraordinarily well. I don't know if Henson Associates is owned by Disney or have a licensing agreement with Disney. I can assure you Big Bird makes more money than everybody in this room. And when I do go to that family in Grand Rapids and say, look, is this what you want your money to go to? I think they might tell me no, that maybe they can afford to do it without us. So that's what I talk about when looking through those various perspectives.
Would you think the same family in Grand Rapids would say, oh, I'm very happy paying $430 million for military bands?
I think that when we look at the priorities that the President has given us, it's not just defense, by the way. You said all of the money is going to defense, and it's not, but I'll answer your question, then I'll fill in some gaps. Yeah, I think folks understand that a proper and appropriate function of the government is to defend the nation. I think, in fact, if we got together and came up with a list, if everybody from every different wing of both parties came up with a list of what they thought the priorities of government should do, my guess is defending the nation would be fairly high up on everybody's list.
Everybody on both sides of this this committee, I'm sure, this Congress.
I think one of the knocks against your party is that you don't believe in national defense. I don't happen to agree with that. I know that you think it's a priority just like we do. Okay, so I think that family in Grand Rapids, if you ask, do you think some of your money should go to defending the nation, the answer would be yes.
Oh, no question about that. I'm just asking about military bands, because you're cutting out NEA and NEH cultural enrichment programs, and then you've got this other program that I would argue really provides no service. But let me say one other thing, and this is just in relation to the methodology that was used here. And I think the media are doing a pretty good job of documenting many of the problems with the assumptions that were made in this budget, the 3% growth rate that no economist thinks is reasonable, the possible double counting of $2 trillion, the notion that tax cuts pay for themselves, which even conservative organizations don't necessarily support. But I just have to repeat what was written today by Michael Grunwald when he said, you know, I can say that I want to dunk, and I can make the assumption that I'm going to grow a foot and return to the athleticism of my 20s, but that's probably not going to happen. And I think that's what many of us are concerned about with the construction of this budget that relies on things that just aren't going to happen. So to make the claim that it balances with basically fantasy land predictions to us is a claim that is not valid. So I thank you for your appearance, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. I now recognize the Vice Chair of the committee, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Rokita.
I thank the Chair, and Mick, it's good to see you back at committee again. I really appreciate the leadership that you and the President and the administration is providing. As you said in your opening, you're putting forth priorities, and there are priorities that are responsible in light of the fact that we're $20 trillion in debt going to $100 trillion before too long. I also take notice that you said this is probably the last budget we're able to do that. That is to say, if we implemented every word of your proposed budget, or something similar, very similar in terms of the numbers, if we reflect our Article 1 priorities, that means in 10 years, we are going to have to look at Social Security, Medicare, again, look at Medicaid perhaps in order to be responsible and sustainable again, because those three programs are eating up so much of our budget. And I really think that Republicans, as when we started out, Mick, 6 years ago, we were saying the same thing as the President. We don't want to affect anyone on or near to be on these programs. But we're looking for something to do for the next generation so that these programs are strengthened and sustainable and around. And not speaking for the President, of course, but that's how I interpret his promise. And that, in fact, we are doing the responsible thing and are saying the same thing. I also appreciate your announcement that DOD will be auditable by the end of this year. I think that's something that you and I both care about. And I thank you for prioritizing school choice, something I work on in my the K-12 education subcommittee that I chair, and we stand fully ready and behind what the President wants to do to make sure that parents can pick the choice that's best for their kids and not be shackled to a particular zip code. When parents have a choice, you know, the kids have a chance, and I thank the President and you for doing that. I want to focus something that's come up in my transportation committee that I'm also on, and that is this ATC privatization. When the CBO scored H.R. 4441 last year, which was the AIR Act, CBO said that privatizing air traffic control would cost nearly $20 billion over the 10-year window. And if our goal is to reduce deficit and not add to the debt like you said, why are we embracing things that are going to cost $20 billion?
Thank you for the question. And by the way, I will apologize in advance to addressing all of you today by your first names. It's a bad habit I got into when I was a member. I'm going to try and call you Mr. Rakita. If I call you Todd, I apologize in advance.
I'm going to call you Mick.
Yep. I've been called a lot. You've called me a lot worse, as I recall. Here's why we do it. Because we think the current system is broken, and we think it supports the expenditure. That when we look around the world, we look at the technology when it comes to air traffic control, we're behind the curve. We're way behind the curve, as a matter of fact. And we do support the efforts that are currently moving through the House.
Well,
that's not
with regard to that, I fly in the system. I use the system 145 hours a year that I'm flying in the system, not just as a passenger. And it's, for the size that we are, which is the biggest in the world, it works well. We continue to search for, many of us, the actual problem that it's that it's trying to solve. We don't think really one exists. Now, you can say Canada, like I think your counterpart mentioned the other day. Gary Cohn said, quote, everyone else has done it, so we know it's relatively easy to do, unquote. So that's the view of the administration that he was referencing Canada, by the way, which is 1/3 the transactions and the size of our system. Just because it was easy to do, and it took Canada nearly a decade, by the way, that all of a sudden it's going to be easy for us to do.
Well, I don't think anything on that scale, Mr. Rakita, would be easy, but I do think the system that you see in other countries that is much more modern, is a satellite-based system instead of a ground-based system, is scalable. That you can take it up to something that is large.
Yeah, but you don't need to take the governance and the dispassionate third party that is the FAA to decide disputes in an ecosystem that has different interests and sometimes competing interests, and turn it over to, it's a monopoly, and you're going to turn it over to the airlines is the problem. That's going to be the effective result of this board, and so that's concerning. But do you guys support all parts of that ATC privatization proposal, even the labor agreement that's been codified in the proposal?
Yeah, Mr. Rakita, I don't get into that level in my budget, because what we do is we look at the monetary impacts of the proposals, not the things.
Well, that's part of the $20 billion cost, is this labor agreement that you're taking from the FAA, from the controllers, and you're actually codifying it and baking it into law, if you agree with that part of the proposal, which was my question. Tax rates on this very thing. The budget states that you will work with Congress to establish successor tax rates if this new ATC corporation is created. Does the administration have a general idea of what those tax rates would be, and would the administration support moving to a user fee for all segments or any of the segments instead of creating new tax rates?
And I'm not trying to dodge your question, Mr. Rakita. It's just we don't get to that level of detail. I understand that Secretary Chow, I think, is on the Hill today or tomorrow. You may get a chance to ask her that question as well.
Okay. Well, this goes to the bottom line budget number,
Yes,
so that's why I asked. Mick, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired, and I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Budget Director Mulvaney. Under your budget, 3 million wealthy Americans get a $213,000 tax cut. 240 not-so-wealthy Americans get a $210 tax cut. I appreciate all the concern about debt, but the White House budget increases the national debt by $5.5 trillion over the next 10 years. This according to the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Economists, right, left, and center, say that tax cuts don't pay for themselves, and they never have. You want 3% annual growth, so do I. The Congressional Budget Office projects lower than 2% growth each year over the next decade. You want growth in the United States economy, you have to invest in that growth. I think China is serious about their growth, and I don't think that we are. And let me explain. China is America's largest trading partner. Last year we sold $115 billion to China, and they sold to America $462 billion. Our trade deficit last year with China was $347 billion for stuff, for goods. China wants to overtake the United States as the global economic leader. China just announced a $1 trillion infrastructure investment to open up China to 47 other Asian countries to sell the stuff they make to 47 new markets much more efficiently. Under your budget, you want $1.4 billion to build a $40 billion wall that we were told that Mexico would pay for. Your budget spends $3 billion a month for a 16-year war in Afghanistan. In response to a $2 trillion need for American roads and bridges with a pathetically weak $200 billion maybe, China is making an aggressive move to challenge the United States global leadership. And the president, in his first budget, does nothing, absolutely nothing, to seriously grow the American economy and to reclaim economic share from China and other countries. Your thoughts on that?
Again, you've given me a bunch to work with. Let me take them in turn, and we can fill in the backfill if you'd like to. You talk about investments in China. Investment is absolutely critical to get economic growth. We all agree on that. I think the difference between you and I and China and myself might be where we think the most effective investments are made. We happen to believe that private capital investment is always more efficient, more effective, and more accountable than government investment. And when you say that we make absolutely no provision for investment in this country, sir, I have to disagree. The whole tax plan that we've come up with is designed to try and drive capital investment. Businesses investing in new technology, investing in people, trying to figure out new markets, that is a much more effective way to get to 3% growth. And I can assure you that we're fairly confident that we can beat the Chinese at that. Regarding the trade deficit, we share your concerns. And I think that's why you've seen a focus on trying to rebalance some of our trade agreements, renegotiate some of our trade agreements. We've made some small progress on that already in the first couple of months. You've seen some small progress, I think, on some agricultural exports to China. You mentioned that China is doing a massive $1 trillion in infrastructure, and we are only doing I can't remember what the diminutive was. $200 billion. And what I would point out to you is that we're proposing to figure out a way, and there are ways, to leverage that to at least $1 trillion worth of spending. Let me tell you how that is. Let me give you an example of how that might be. Yeah. You're a governor, and you want to build a road, okay? And the road is going to cost you $100 million, okay? And you've tried to figure out a way to pay for it, and you just can't. And you can only raise $80 million. What if we kicked in the extra 20? That's a $100 million road that would not have otherwise been built with a $20 million federal investment. That
Let me just reclaim
is a 5-to-1
my
return
time,
on that investment.
Respectfully, just
Yes,
because I have a few minutes. We spent $108 billion rebuilding the roads and bridges of Afghanistan. We spent $78 billion rebuilding the roads and bridges of Iraq. And they were all deficit financed in the traditional way that goes back to Lincoln in how you do it. He called them land improvements. You issue debt over the length of an infrastructure project. Cities, villages, towns, and states do it all the time. And what the infrastructure investment does, sir, it unleashes the resources of the private sector. And you see that from Buffalo, New York, to Boston, Massachusetts,
The gentleman's
and throughout the
time has
nation.
expired.
So I just think that we need a more serious attempt to get away from building walls and build bridges and roads that are in desperate need of repair
The gentleman's
throughout
time
America.
has expired.
I yield back. Thank you.
I don't mean to interrupt when you're making a comment. I really appreciate the fact that you want to finish your comment, but if I could ask everyone to try to stay within the time, because these committee meetings do run very long, and I know everybody has other meetings they need to go to. So, and now I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Diaz-Balart, for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much. Mr. Mulvaney, good to see you, sir. Let me first thank you for being accessible. You've been exceedingly accessible to all of us who have had questions, issues, and that is refreshing and grateful. I'm not going to talk to you about some of the issues. You know, you know that in my other life as an appropriator, I chaired THUD, and we'll have ample opportunity to talk. And I know that the President and you are emphasizing, again, infrastructure, and that's something that I'm very happy about, and we'll have ample opportunity to talk about details. So let me kind of shift to talk about a little bit about national security. I'm pleased that this budget recognizes the importance of our military and national security. I don't have to tell you that for the number of years in the last administration, military spending was in essence held hostage to non-military discretionary spending. That is something that was broken, fortunately, in the 17 omnibus that was just passed. And I don't have to tell you, sir, about the growing threats around the world, how the world is in flames. And again, I believe that having a strong military is essential for our security, for the stability of the world, for ourselves and our allies, and the United States must continue to lead. And I also believe that, by the way, part of, however, that is investing not only in defense, but also in targeted soft diplomacy and funding there. Obviously, a big part of having a safe world and a safe nation is that when the President of the United States sets a red line, that red line is enforced. So let me talk to you a little bit about again, where you see that spending, military spending going, how you see the future of our armed forces. That's one issue that I'd like you to elaborate a bit on. The second thing, that if we have some time, and I'm going to open it up to you, is I keep hearing that 3% growth is not possible anymore in the United States of America. We have to give up on 3% growth for the future, for our children and our children's children, that is not reasonable anymore. I refuse to acknowledge that and believe that if we do some things, that my 11-year-old son will inherit the same country that we inherited, which is not a country growing at 2% growth. And the forecasts are that if we don't change the track, that's exactly what we're going to be condemning our children for. So if you would talk a little bit about, obviously, whether, tax reform, reg reform is key, domestic energy production is key, a little bit as to how you foresee this budget and frankly, this administration looking at ways to make sure that our kids do not inherit what some believe is inevitable, which is a country that will never grow above 2%.
Thank you, Congressman. A couple different things that you asked me where we thought the defense spending is headed, and of course what's driving all of this is the President's promise, and I'll come back to this again and again during the testimony today, the President's promise to undo the sequester. And that was what drove the decision. The top-line spending number that you see in our budget, which is $603 billion this year for defense, I think is the exact number it would have been but for the sequester. So that's what we see is a pre-sequester spending level, informed by what's going on right now. We're in the middle of our new national defense strategy. And we're looking forward to getting that information from Secretary Mattis. The President also made promises, again coming back to that theme on the campaign trail, about the size of the forces, and you'll see funding to try and get us in that direction. I'll be perfectly candid with you. It's very difficult to do given some of the industrial base that we have now, but we're working on ways to try and address those problems. So the President is just as committed as you are to trying to figure out a way to fix some of the damage that may have been done during the previous administration within the Defense Department. Regarding 3% growth, I'm stunned. I mean, there was an article the other day, I think, again, in the Washington Post that said it was an outrageous assumption. How pessimistic do you have to be to assume that 3% growth, which is less than the historical average going back to the founding of the country, less than the historical average going back to the end of World War II, that is somehow unreasonable? What does it say about the previous administration? What does it say about the CBO, about their view of the country, that they don't think we're ever going to be able to do that again? We refuse to accept it as well, Congressman, as you mentioned. We think that if that's where you are, then don't accept it. Help us figure out a way to get back to 3% growth. Taxing doesn't do it, but come up with other ideas that work with us on trying to figure out a way to get to 3% growth, because everybody around the table will benefit in terms of your role as lawmaker. Every one of your children will benefit in your role as parents. 3% growth should not be something we're just sort of talking about. It should be what drives everything that we do.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome back, Mick. There was something I wanted to ask you about. You said a few moments ago that we shouldn't worry about Sesame Street and the rest of the PBS programs because Big Bird is making more money than any of us in this room. Well, I guess the good news is if Big Bird really is a billionaire, he's standing to get a huge tax cut from the Trump budget that does more to help billionaires and less to do working people and middle-class people that happen to populate my district. I want to key in on one broken promise of this budget, and that is as it relates to transportation and infrastructure. Many principal conservatives, such as yourself, don't necessarily agree with a big transportation and infrastructure plan, and I respect that viewpoint. President Trump is someone, though, who clearly does. When he came dozens and dozens of times to my state of Pennsylvania, he talked, frankly, like a Democrat and said things that I happen to agree with and many of us agree with on the need to repair our historically decrepit infrastructure, which the American Society of Civil Engineers has given us a D+. We don't even rank in the top 20 anymore in the world. That should bother all of us as Americans. So President Trump, as a candidate, talked about a $1 trillion infrastructure plan. When the Democratic nominee for president released her plan, he, as the Republican nominee, criticized it not for spending too much, a historically Republican position, but for spending too little. Well, here we are now with the budget plan, and instead of having that $1 trillion plan, something that I would sincerely like to work with him on in this administration in a bipartisan way, instead it's actually $200 billion. Just a fraction of the $1 trillion that he talked about and that is the bare minimum that we need as a country, according to the experts. And it turns out that $200 billion isn't even real, because included in the same budget is a $95 billion cut in the Highway Trust Fund. I don't think anyone driving America's highways drives them thinking, boy, we're spending too much on highways. These are just so state-of-the-art and don't need any repair. So I want to ask you about that, about why it falls so short of what Donald Trump says as a candidate. And I also, before you do that, just want to make a point about spending and investment. Not all spending is the same. Granted, if someone took $60,000 and spent it on some sort of luxury car, that would be, while perhaps fun, wasteful spending. That has no return on investment. It depreciates the moment you buy it. However, if you take instead that amount of money and invest it, for example, in the Community Development Block Grant Program, there's one program I know about in the neighborhood that I grew up in Philadelphia, an area that has been overlooked for decades. They took this small Community Development Block Grant on the North 5th Street corridor and invested it into the main borough business thoroughfare, something that once was thriving and had really fallen down for decades. With just that little bit amount of money, they were able to improve not just the storefronts that they worked on, but then to actually bring business back to that area. It had, in other words, a multiplier effect. And now you see that business thoroughfare, that corridor, thriving again and good things happening. That was an investment. That is quite different from just taking the same amount of money and spending it on something wasteful. So I think too often those of us in Washington, D.C., especially my friends on the other side, treat all spending as the same when really we should look at the return on investment of these dollars. And any time we spend on education, or I would argue the Community Development Block Grant Program, we are actually investing in rebuilding this country. So with that, as I say again, welcome back. And you are an example of someone who I have many disagreements with on policy, but shows that good people can still be friends and work together on these issues.
Mr. Director, do you think you can answer that in 20 seconds?
I could do Big Bird in 20 seconds. Big Bird actually does get a fairly large tax cut, and we want him to, because Henson & Associates, that owns Big Bird, has been paying the highest corporate tax rate in the world for the last several years. And we want them to have more money to reinvest in that type of creativity that created Big Bird in the first place, because we believe that Henson & Associates is a lot more creative than we are. And we believe that money will be much better invested by a private corporation, by private individuals, than it would be by the government. And I'm happy to talk about infrastructure. I'm sure I'll get that question again. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. I want to remind the members one more time that you have a total of 5 minutes, so if you leave the director 20 seconds, we're only going to be able to give him 20 seconds to answer the question. With that, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Mr. Director, it is really great to have you back here again. In full disclosure, shortly after my questions, I'm going to have to get up and leave because I've got to go chair a hearing for Secretary DeVos, so please don't take anything amiss on that.
We'll let Mr. Yarmouth read your closing statement. How about that?
I want to start and compliment you, frankly. It is a huge sea change to see a representative of the President of the United States bring us a budget that tries to balance and does balance within 10 years. We haven't seen that in a long time. And just the shift in emphasis that that represents is a really welcome change. And I want to congratulate you for it. I think, we can all disagree with this or that, but that one change is fundamental to going forward. I also want to thank you for the emphasis on defense. I sit on Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. I think that's a wise choice. And to some of my colleagues that are critical, I want to also point out that the President could have gone a lot further here. There's a lot of people certainly on my side of the aisle and the House Armed Services Committee that wanted a $640 billion line. So I think this is actually a pretty prudent balance of letting us move back in the right direction. But even that number to me shows fiscal restraint. You could have gone a lot further, and in some ways I would have liked it, but I think you made the wise decision financially for the good of the country. And there are a lot of your proposed cuts in here that I strongly support. I suppose you probably had, you won't take credit for it, but I'm going to give you credit for Social Security disability. I know the President, this is an area in which he has not wanted to go, and I'm glad that you talked to him about this, because I think ultimately that's the big crisis we're going to face, as my friend Mr. Rokita suggested down the road. Entitlements are where we're going to have to come back to at some point. I just think the math drives you there. I've got two areas I want to ask you about. One is with respect to entitlements. What is the spending balance between mandatory and discretionary spending today? And in 10 years under your budget, what will that balance be?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, Mr. Cole, but I think right now you're looking at, 5% of the budget, 72% of the budget is mandatory, and that will continue to grow. Because what we, in essence, do is we keep the BCA caps in place on total discretionary, but allow defense to grow. So it should not change from current law in terms of the distribution. Mandatory will continue to get larger and larger as part of our total spending.
Again, I would suggest that bears some more thought, and I hope we see it in your next budget, because honestly that math can't be sustained. And it will crowd out eventually defense and other areas, I think, important national investment.
And we look forward to talking with you about that.
I know you will, because I know from our time together on this committee how serious you take that sort of thing. So I don't, again, I don't question anybody. You work for a president. It's your job to advance and defend his views. And but I hope over time we can have that dialogue, because I don't think we're on a sustainable course. One place where I do think we are being, in your budget, penny wise and pound foolish are National Institute of Health and Center for Disease Control. Those are relatively modest investments, and they're investments that Congress on a bipartisan basis has increased in the last 2 years. And let me tell you why we've done it. We've done it partly because we think obviously it's the right thing to do. You want good health outcomes for the American people. But it's also the fiscally prudent thing to do. Right now, in your budget and in Medicaid, we're spending $259 billion a year taking care of Alzheimer's patients and people with dementia. Right thing for us to do. But that will rise to over $1 trillion in uninflation-adjusted dollars by 2050. And we've had now back-to-back the two largest increases in Alzheimer's funding really ever. The reason, again, is to try and deal with the dread disease, but also to get ahead of this thing fiscally so we can either cure it, hopefully, or if you even slow down the progression. So, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond, but I think there you should look. And I will also tell you, sometime in the President's term, you will have a pandemic. You will have a Zika, you will have Ebola, and cutting the Center for Disease Control, I think, leaves you very vulnerable and the American people very vulnerable. So I want to give you an opportunity to reply to those things.
Let me address very briefly, thank you for that, the NIH, because we actually, despite what you may have heard in the press, we wholeheartedly support research in this area. We especially support research at what we call basic research, which is the stuff that's early in the process, that's far away from marketability, and the stuff that will not get done or is less likely to get done unless the government does it. But I encourage the entire committee to consider this, which is the biggest change we made in NIH, is to look at the overhead costs. If a private foundation gives a university money, typically the university is required to spend 90% of that money on actual research. Only 10% goes to overhead costs. But with our money, it's 72% actually goes to research. So I'd encourage you to look at ways to lower the overhead, because if you look at the numbers, Mr. Cole, at 90% research in our budget, you'd actually be roughly spending the same amount on actual research as you did in previous years.
We'll have that debate another day, but
Yes, sir.
again, I want to thank my friend for being here and thank him for his service.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Connor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Mulvaney, for being here. I want to recognize Representative Cole's thoughtful comments on the NIH and appreciate your speaking out on that. We have very strong philosophical disagreements about the budget, but I don't want to spend my 5 minutes on that. I'm a freshman new around here, so I'm going to try on two concrete issues where I hope we may find common ground, and I hope you may keep an open mind. The first is the Manufacturing Extensionship Partnership. This was a program that President Reagan started. I worked at the Department of Commerce. It helps small and medium-sized manufacturers. Many of them, the way it helps them is, you look at my district, Silicon Valley, they have cloud technology. This program says, how do we get our small and medium-sized manufacturers using cloud technology, other things, to be competitive, to create jobs in an environment where trade is unfair. My sense is it was zeroed out. It's 0.003% of the budget by some junior staffer. I'm convinced if the president actually met with the manufacturers who are benefiting from the program, or if you met with him, he would probably want to quadruple the budget, given how he campaigned. And my question is, could we at least have the president meet with some of the manufacturers who are benefiting with this program, or could you take a look at it? Because honestly, it was a Reagan program. It's bipartisan, and it's probably the biggest thing we can do to help manufacturers.
It was a Reagan. Thank you for that, Congressman. It was a Reagan program, and I had a policy when I sat in your chair, which was that I always careful about my Reagan quotes and my Bible quotes, because my guess is you could always find something on the other side of the argument from the same source. So I'm going to be very careful. My Reagan quote, I also think he said one time, there was nothing as permanent as a temporary government program. This program was, under the Reagan administration, was designed to be temporary. In fact, you're only supposed to be on it for 6 years. There have been folks who have been on it for literally decades, and that's why it got our attention. Again, coming back to the folks who pay for it, say, look, yeah, maybe we can justify giving seed money to businesses so they can get a start and get their feet underneath them, but it's supposed to be temporary, and it's not, and that was the reason we sourced this. We focused on this program. But to your request about having the president get personally involved, I think the president has already shown a tremendous interest in talking with manufacturers. A lot of his focus so far in terms of the executive action has been on manufacturing, and your invitation is welcome indeed, sir. Thank you.
I appreciate it. I just would ask that you take a look at it and the manufacturers benefiting. The second area, I had the privilege of going down to Congressman Hal Rogers' district in Appalachia, near Ranking Member Yarmouth's district. And as you know, Hal Rogers is one of the most distinguished members of this body. He's Republican, chaired the Appropriations Committee. What I saw there were coal miners' kids getting apprenticeship programs, jobs, learning iOS software for Apple, learning Android software at Google. I mean, these are jobs in Appalachia, jobs in Middle America, future jobs. The Appalachia Regional Commission funded this program, and I think you should talk to Congressman Rogers about it. I urge that, again, that the president may visit this area and see what's happening, because this is how he campaigned. He said, I want to help folks here get the jobs. The Appalachia Regional Commission does exactly that. Again, my hope would be he would quadruple the funding. People often say, well, the Democrats participate in supporting things that the president does. If the president were to say, let's quadruple funding for the Appalachia Regional Commission, I'd vote for it. But that's zeroed out. And is there a way we could have the president visit there, or you visit there, and see firsthand the jobs that are being created for coal miners' kids and others in that area.
And I appreciate that. And I believe the president, and I don't keep track of his travel schedule as probably as closely as I should. I think he's already been to that part of the country at least once. I know he's been to Kentucky at least once. Whether he got into eastern Kentucky, I can't remember. Your points about the Appalachian Regional Commission are well taken, and certainly there are anecdotes of success within that program. It's just when we sat down to look at it, as we mentioned with our new perspective, we had a very difficult time confirming that it was regularly as successful as you mentioned. That being said, we still recognize the need in the area. So while we did zero out the Appalachian Regional Commission, we moved the money around to programs that we thought were even more effective, or at least we could prove were more effective. So the budget provides an additional $80 million for the Department of Agriculture's Rural Economic Infrastructure Grant Program, which includes community centers, housing repair, distance learning, telemedicine, broadband grants, and the like. It also provides an additional $66 million for job training and employment services through the Department of Labor. So again, your points are well taken, and we tend to agree that those areas are a place that do deserve federal attention. I guess I can come back to folks in Southern California and say, can I take some of your money to move to the Appalachia region because of the challenges that it faces? And the answer is yes, but we'd like to do it through more effective programs than we're able to identify at the Appalachian Regional Commission.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas,
Did
Mr.
I guess
Westerman,
right, by the
for
way, on
5
Southern
minutes.
California? By the way, I guessed at that. Was that not right?
Northern California.
Okay, all right.
Mr. Westerman,
Got
you're
the state
recognized.
right, so.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Mulvaney, thank you for being here today, and thank you for the hard work that you've put into this budget proposal. It is refreshing to see a proposal that actually balances in 10 years. You're in a tough situation. Anytime you talk about cutting anything, somebody's not going to be happy about that. But it takes courage to put these cuts on the table. We may not all agree with the same areas where we need to prioritize spending, but I think we all, at least on this side of the dais, agree that we have to do something about the debt that's in our country and the burden that it's putting on our children, our future generations. So I appreciate the courage that you took in putting forth this. Now, I've read the headlines about draconian cuts and deep budget cuts. So, I'd like to go back and look at the numbers. And as I study these numbers, there's a phenomena here that I think the general public may not understand, and maybe even a lot of people in D.C. don't totally understand. But we have this process called the baseline budget. And as I look at the baseline budget, over the 10-year window, it starts at $4.1 trillion and it goes to $6.7 trillion. That's $2.6 trillion of increase over the 10-year window. That's a 63% increase. So if you simplify it and average that, that's 6.3% increase in each of the 10 years for the next 10 years. That's the baseline. So if we look at the budget, this so-called draconian budget that you've proposed, it starts at $4.1 trillion. It goes to $5.7 trillion in 2027, which is a $1.6 trillion increase over the 10-year window, or a 39% increase, or 3.9% per year over that 10-year window. Could you explain in a little more detail about how, when we say cut in Washington, D.C., and I served in my state legislature as well, where we had to balance the budget. I worked in a business where when we talked about a cut, it meant that it was less money next year than it was the year before. And my home and the other families I know in my district, when they talk about a cut to their budget, it actually means you spend less money next year than you spent last year. However, in D.C. in budgeting, we can still spend more money than we spent last year and call it a cut somehow. Would you explain that in more detail?
Sure. Here's how I used to do it back home when I was trying to explain it to people. In Washington, D.C., if we spent $100 on a program last year and $100 on a program this year, back home we would call that a freeze. In Washington, we call that a cut. If we spent $100 on a program last year and $104 on a program this year, back home we would call that an increase. In Washington, D.C., we call that a cut. Back home, if you spent $100 last year and $106 this year, back home you call that an increase. Here we call it a freeze. And it's not until you spend $100 last year and $108 this year that we call it an increase in both normal, back home English, and Washington-ese. And that's because of what you mentioned, baseline budgeting. The baseline assumes that we're going to grow the government at population plus inflation, I think, every single year. And it leads to that. I can't tell you the number of people used to come to my office, Mr. Westerman, and say, 2 years ago, oh, you cut my budget on this. I'm like, no, we didn't. They said, well, everyone's telling me you cut my budget. I said, no, all we did was grow it slower than otherwise. And they said, well, that sounds like an increase. And I said, yes, it does. And they said, well, why is everybody telling me it's a cut? I said, so you will come to Washington and tell me to give you more money. That's how the system works, and that's why I am a big fan of zero-based budgeting, getting away from the baseline and actually using English language that people can understand. If you want to be real cynical about it, under the world where we spent $100 last year and $104, okay, to your conservative friends back home, and we all have them in both parties, you could say, you know what, I cut that program, because in Washington that's a cut. But to your more liberal-minded friends back home, and we all have those in both parties, you say, you know what, I like that program too. We spent more money on that. And both of those statements are right, one using back home English and one using Washingtonese. And I think it's part of the thing that undermines the credibility of the institution, that we have to start speaking a language up here that everybody can understand. So I thank you for drawing attention to the effort. I do encourage this committee to continue to look at ways to articulate how we spend money better. Go back to my opening statement, explaining to people how much government really costs them, because I think in the long term, folks in both parties will be well served by that. But thank you for that question.
I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Director Mulvaney. I am very pleased that I had the opportunity to give the opening statement on behalf of our excellent ranking member. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of things and then get to some questions. Let's talk about clear language and telling the American people exactly what's happening in this budget. We are slashing in this budget, you are slashing Medicaid by $610 billion. Combined with the health care cut, that's almost $1.5 trillion of cuts to a program that currently serves 74 million Americans. So in plain language for the American people, that is a dramatic cut to their health care, for most people health care that they wouldn't be able to get elsewhere. A $1.2 billion cut to Centers for Disease Control. Clear English cuts drug addiction treatment and prevention services. A $1 billion cut to housing assistance programs, including for veterans who are struggling to keep a roof over their heads. We talked about infrastructure already, so I won't go into that. Mentioned SNAP. This is nutritional assistance for the most needy families in our country. And let's just talk about the border wall for a second. This is a $1.6 billion investment into what I call the wall to nowhere. This is a wall, a down payment on a wall that is ultimately going to cost the taxpayers $40 billion, according to a recent MIT study. And as Janet Napolitano once said when she was governor of Arizona, show me a 100-foot wall, I'll show you a 101-foot ladder. This is not the solution to any of our immigration issues. Now, you've said, Director Mulvaney, that you should have called this a taxpayer-first budget, but I have to ask you, which taxpayer? Out of the almost $1 trillion in tax cuts in this budget, which are on the backs of all these other cuts we've mentioned, 50% of those tax cuts are going to go to the top 1%. And 75% of the tax cuts are going to go to the top 75% of income earners. So what we're doing is taking away essential benefits for working families across this country, positions that the president ran on, and putting them into the top earners in the country. So when you talk about Trump-onomics, I think that was the word you used in your opening statement, and you said, let's do anything that gets you to 3% growth, is that the same philosophy that got the president to 6 separate bankruptcies, $1.8 billion in debt for Trump hotels before he declared those bankruptcies? I'm not really sure what Trump-onomics is when you look at the president's records. And so what I'd like to ask you, Director Mulvaney, is can you explain how taking away from programs like the Children's Health Insurance Program, the disabled, and student loan repayments, one of the top issues in this country, Republicans and Democrats alike, $1.4 trillion in student loan debt right now. Can you explain how that benefits the economy or working families across this country? And I might reclaim my time, too, just to make sure, but let's start there.
I can try. because folks are throwing me notes because you raised a bunch of issues, so let me do this in a rapid form as I possibly can. CHIP is being extended. It's not being reduced. Total spending on drug treatment goes up. It's not being reduced. You use the word plain language slashing Medicaid. To most people, plain language slashing Medicaid would mean we spend less next year than we did this year. That's what a slash means, right? That's what you hear in the no, it's not true. I think it's 1 year in the 10-year window where we have a little tiny dip because of the cliff that's caused by the AHCA on the Medicaid expansion states. But generally speaking, across the budget, all we do is slow the rate of growth, which is to say we will be spending more on Medicaid every single year, again, I think except one. And you can call that a slash, but I'm telling you back home, when people say you slashed spending on something, I think they would expect you to think that you're spending less money 1 year versus the previous year. The SNAP, what we do on SNAP is a couple different things, and again, we can take more time on this if you like. We do ask for an able body work requirement. We can go into the fact that SNAP went up dramatically during the downturn from, I think, roughly 28 million people on the program before the recession to 47 million people on the program at the height of the recession. I think the most recent number we have is roughly 42 or 44 million. We're back near what we like to call full employment. We've had several years of a slow but growing economy. Don't we think that maybe some of those folks should have come off of SNAP? And again, I apologize for doing that. Yeah.
We're limited, so I'm sorry for that. But I think if you look at what the American people thought about the Republican health care bill, you'll see that that slash in Medicaid is, in fact, a slash in Medicaid that even Republican governors spoke out against. Let me ask you about Social Security, because you've consistently said that you're not cutting Social Security. $72 billion in cuts
time has
to
expired.
Social Security,
Ms.
including
Jayapal,
Social Security disability insurance.
I
Thank you,
may.
Madam Chair. I yield back.
If I may, and you have additional questions that you're not able to get in your 5 minutes, I know that the director would be happy to answer those in writing for you. So now I would like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Renacci.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank you, Director Mulvaney, for your service to the House of Representatives, and now as OMB Director. It's always been a pleasure working with you, and I continue to admire your passion for public service and your understanding of fiscal challenge facing our nation. I applaud the President and your office for putting together a budget that balances over the next 10 years and your commitment to addressing the debt and deficit crisis that faces our country. While I may not agree with all the policies, I am encouraged to finally have an administration that understands that we need to get our fiscal house in order. Right now, we're quite simply on an unsustainable path, and this proposed budget is recognition of that reality. I'm going to use a few words. My colleagues on the other side said slashing and cutting, but wouldn't you really agree that your budget is reducing what we borrow from China to pay for programs we don't have money to pay for?
Absolutely.
That's what I thought. And would you also agree that today our corporate tax rate at 35% is the highest in the world, so we can continue to say we don't charge corporations enough, but if we continue to do that, they'll just go overseas, and then we'll have less money to spend. Would you agree with that?
Which is exactly what they've done for the last several years.
Exactly. And on the personal side, today, 70% of our individuals actually pay as pass-throughs, corporate businesses, so they're businesses that employ people, and eventually, since 70% of them are paying a rate that's higher than most worldwide tax rates, they're going to find places to go other than the United States, which will also take revenues away from us if we don't come up with a plan to reduce taxes.
Taking jobs with them as they go.
Absolutely. So we can continue to say you're slashing and cutting and all those other words we want to use, but clearly what you're doing is you're looking at a budget and saying we can't continue to borrow, we can't continue to pass this on to our children and grandchildren. Shame on everybody that continues to do this year after year and doesn't realize that all we're doing is handing our children and grandchildren a debt they can never pay. So I appreciate what you're doing. Would you also agree that if we do nothing and we don't start looking at the programs that aren't valuable and that aren't working, that our debt will become one of our greatest concerns and our interest costs will start to begin to swallow the budget? In fact, the Congressional Budget Office says our interest, if it stays as it is, will still triple in 3 years based on our debt growing.
I think they used to put out a report that said it would take 100% of revenues under certain circumstances by the 2050s, but I think they took down that graph.
So we are clearly at a real problem here with budgeting and how we spend money, because we can continue to say we're slashing and cutting, but clearly what we're doing is we're borrowing money we don't have, and we're continuing to spend money we don't have, and we're continuing to be willing to pass that on to our children and grandchildren, and only say that the only way to fix it is to raise more revenues from people when, again, as I said, if we continue to raise our taxes, businesses will just leave, companies will just leave, and we'll have less and less revenue. So I want to make sure we understand that. So I want to switch gears over to tax reform, which I really believe is an opportunity. And I appreciate you talking about getting to 3%, because if we don't at least set a goal around here of 3%, you're exactly right. We might as well say that we will never be able to balance a budget. So whether people agree we can get to 3% or not, I think we should all be focused in on 3%, and that's why I'm a big believer in tax reform and growth. I have a question for you regarding the budget window. Do you believe that Congress should consider expanding the budget window beyond 10 years in order to make tax reform more permanent and increase the likelihood of Congress able to pass some type of tax reform this year?
I do, and my understanding is that you can do that without legislative change, that you all have the ability to look at different periods of time. My understanding is over the course of the last couple of administrations, some budgets have been 5 years, some have been 7. We sort of settled on this 10-year budget window for the last couple of years, and we'll continue to do it like that. We are exploring the possibility of also looking a little further out, especially when you start to talk about changes in mandatory spending. Even putting aside for a second Social Security and Medicare, if you don't look out beyond the 10-year window, if you want to phase some changes in, a lot of the benefits aren't reaped until outside the budget window. So I think it's a more reasonable way to look at the budget window, and I think it's important for us to look at whatever options give us the best and most common sense view of the economy and our proposals to change it.
You would also probably agree, and I know you and I served on the Budget Committee, but also on other committees. In the old days, with a 10-year budget, we pass legislation that really dumps everything into the 11th year in many cases. All the problems are in the 11th and 12th year. I even think the Affordable Care Act dumped a lot in the 11th and 12th year. Wouldn't you agree?
It is possible, Congressman, to game the system in order to move the costs of a program outside of the budget window. We're coming very close to the outside budget window of the original Affordable Care Act, and now you're starting to see the costs rack up at an exponential rate.
I agree, and I know I'm running out of time. I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, Mr. Director. Really want to first say to you that never before really have I seen such a cruel and morally bankrupt budget. It dismantles our nation's basic living standards, which Americans have turned to for decades. This budget, and you know this, it will push millions of people into poverty and over the edge. This budget destroys people's lives. This budget, what you're doing is you're asking people to fend for themselves, and you're really leaving them out in the cold. And our moral obligation is to make sure that every American has a decent standard of living. This budget is a broken promise, and it's really a betrayal to every American in favor of tax cuts for millionaires, billionaires, and corporations. I'd like to just ask you, how are people going to eat when they need a temporary helping hand with a cut of $190 million in food assistance? Then you add these onerous work requirements, and then yet you cut $1.3 billion in workforce training programs so people cannot be trained or retrained for jobs, which I don't see much in terms of investment in job creation in this budget either. How are people going to get health insurance with a cut of $1.3 trillion in Medicaid? And how are people going to get a house to either purchase or rent with the elimination of the Housing Trust Fund and a $2 billion cut in rental assistance? You're forcing families to choose between putting food on the table and a roof over their head, and that's just downright wrong. You're forcing them to choose between life-saving prescription drugs and higher education. Again, that's wrong. And I guess I just have to say, with looking at these percentage of cuts, EPA 30%, Department of State 29%, Ag 20%, Education 13%, Housing 13%, Interior 10%, Health and Human Services 16.2%, Department of Labor 19.8%, Department of Commerce 15.8%. You wipe out the Minority Business Development Agency. The Department of Transportation, 13% cut. For the life of me, I just have to remind my colleagues that Steve Bannon said that part of the goal of this administration was deconstruction of the administrative state, and I think what we see here is really the elimination of the public sector. And so, Director Mulvaney, I just want to ask you, one is, are these SNAP cuts, for example, how do you think people are going to survive when they need this helping hand? Most people on SNAP don't rely on this for a lifetime. It's a bridge over troubled waters.
Thank you, Congressman. I'll deal with a couple of things in reverse order if I can. SNAP, as I may have mentioned, I've forgotten how many times I've answered the question.
And also, let me remind you, Secretary Perdue mentioned that it was a program that was working. Why fix it if it's not broken? And he appeared to not be aware that you all were going to recommend these cuts.
I think it's reasonable to ask if you had 28 million people on SNAP before the recession, 47 million people on it at the height of the recession, and 42 or 44 million people today, it's not unreasonable to ask if there are folks on SNAP who should not be, because we should have seen that number go down. SNAP should be counter-cyclical. It should go up during bad economic times and come down during better economic times, and we've not seen that. The EPA was a promise that the President made.
But Mr. Mulvaney, at least 20% of people eligible for SNAP don't even receive SNAP because of stigma and other reasons. So there are more people who need SNAP benefits.
That may be. Let me deal with the every American deserves a decent standard of living. Does that include our kids?
And you have a 13% cut in the Department of Education. Those are the most vulnerable kids who need.
What about the standard of living for my grandchildren who aren't here yet, who will end up inheriting $30 trillion in debt, $50 trillion in debt, $100 trillion in debt? What about their standard? Who's going to pay the bill, Congressman? That's what this is all about. That's what this new perspective is. Who is going to pay for all the stuff you just mentioned? Us or somebody else? And I suggest to you, if it's important enough for us to pay to have, then we should be paying for it. Because right now, my unborn grandchildren are paying for it, and I think that is morally bankrupt.
I have grandchildren also, and I want to make sure that they have the opportunity to get a job so that they can help pay for our government, which is a government that should be enhancing the standard of living and making sure everyone has a chance for the American dream.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Mr. Director. First of all, congratulations on your selection for this position. You got a awesomely tough job, and I appreciate having worked with you for the last 6 years. I associate my position with yours in the sense that our children and grandchildren are expecting us to address this problem now, because it's not going to get any easier. And I hear the cries from my colleagues on the other side calling for more opportunities. Well, I don't know that the federal government has ever created jobs. That's a private market-driven economy that creates jobs, and if we're over $20 trillion in debt, that's just going to get that much worse. I appreciate that we finally have an administration that understands how critically important it is to bend the spending curve in the other direction. And I certainly accept that there are some very, very tough budget decisions to make to get us there. And so I think you and the team have done a remarkable job putting together a budget that does exactly that. Now, we all know that this is a proposal, that ultimately the final say will come from Congress, because that's where the power of the purse resides. But this is a significant step in the right direction. That being said, I do want to bring one thing to your attention. You and I actually talked about this a little bit yesterday as we met outside of this room. I'm concerned with the rationale about the Appalachian Regional Commission. I understand the logic. I understand what you're saying about moving that money around. My concern stems from two basic premises. One, I think the study that you cite, Mr. Director, indicating that there's not a lot of evidence that ARC has lived up to its reputation. If I'm not mistaken, that's a nearly 30-year ago study. That's a 1996 study by GAO. And I think if you look at what has happened, let's take last year, for example, $175 million investments by the ARC into 662 projects across the region. That money being matched with another $257 million by the local governments, and an additional $443 million in leveraged private investments. You know, that brings us to a total of $866 million of investment through the Appalachian Regional Commission into 93 counties that are 76% of that money is going to those 93 counties that are considered economically distressed. And so my first point is, I think that 96 study is probably outdated. I would urge either you or the GAO or someone to take another closer look at what the Appalachian Regional Commission has been doing over recent years. And number two, I understand giving the states and the governors the moving this money around so that they have more flexibility. But look, I live in Appalachia, and I can tell you that governors are concerned about the regions where the voters are, the big metropolitan areas. And when the money gets doled out, I know personally from history where how that money gets allocated. So. While I'm very optimistic on the budget and think you guys have done a great job, I would just urge you to go back and take another look. And one final thing, I really was pleased to see that the administration reversed its position on the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Funding for the, right now with the opioid epidemic being what it is, the President's task force is in place. We need to make sure we have a national focus on that, so I appreciate that. And I've taken up all the time with my comment.
And I appreciate that, Congressman, and we will look into that study for you. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Carvajal, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Black. Thank you, Mr. Mulvaney, for being here. I must say I have to start with your comment about Democrats not supporting defense and military. Have you ever served, Mr. Mulvaney?
Actually, Congressman, I think my comment was that you do believe in defense.
I heard it otherwise.
I'm sorry. Then I would like to correct the record. I think I said you were accused of not supporting national defense, and I thought that was wrong. That you
well, thank you. I misheard it.
Like we do.
So I appreciate you setting the record, because I had some choice words for you. So thank you. Let me just say that. For a number of years, the Department of Defense oversees contingency operations known as OCO designation, which has been used as a budget practice to circumvent budget caps. There are now billions of dollars in OCO funding being used to fund so-called base budget activities. This practice obfuscates the true cost of regular government operations. This incentivizes trade-offs in the budget and inhibits long-term planning. Director Mulvaney, does using OCO designation in this way adhere to your notion of sound budgeting and accounting principles? You've been a fierce critic of the OCO budget as a member of Congress and have characterized it as a gimmick, and you have sponsored legislation to curb this practice. Does your budget include OCO funding for non-war activities?
Congressman, our budget does include OCO during the 10-year practice, and your criticism is well taken and well put. It can be and has been a way to get around budget caps in the past. It has included things that perhaps are not properly defined as OCO. I simply suggest to you a couple of things. First of all, both parties seem to be interested in using it that way. The reason that it's used that way is that there's a bipartisan support for using it that way. What I encourage you to look at is this. If you look at the tables in the budget, you'll see that we slowly reduce the OCO numbers in the out years in hopes that we can instill some discipline in the OCO line item so that it is used for what it's supposed to be used for, which is overseas contingency operations. I would also suggest to you that one of the reasons I think it has been used in the fashion in which it has been used for the last several years is because the top line defense number was simply not enough to accomplish the missions that we were on. So your criticisms are well taken, and I can assure you that I am as skeptical of long-term use of the OCO in ways that are not as intended, and we'll continue to look at it very closely at the Office of Management and Budget.
Mr. Mulvaney, you know that past Democrat and Republican administrations, as well as Congress and the Armed Services Committee, have failed to get the DOD to do an audit, to really look at the waste. Clearly, you would agree that there's many examples of waste in the Department of Defense. And having said that, it is quite disappointing that we look to waste in domestic programs. We point those out extremely rapidly, but we kind of just gloss over them when it comes to increasing Department of Defense spending. There seems to be a hypocrisy. And I guess I ask you, why is that the case?
And I apologize, Congressman, again, I may have covered this before you came into the room on a previous question. I share, as does the President, your interest in finding more efficiency, more accountability inside the Department of Defense. In fact, I can assure you it is a priority for the President, a priority that I have discussed at length with Secretary Mattis, and he is as interested as you and I are in trying to drive out that waste within the Defense Department, because a wasted dollar is a dollar that is not going to defending the nation. Regarding audits, what I'd mentioned earlier in the hearing was that the DOD, I believe, is required by law to make itself auditable by September. They just gave an update on that a couple weeks ago, and they intend, or they tell me and they tell you, that they intend to hit that deadline. One of the reasons that you see more focus on the domestic side and not on defense or domestic non-defense discretionary is that we have the ability to sort of look at those programs. There are tools available to us that don't exist at the Defense Department because they are not auditable. But I'm looking forward to them following through on their promise to be fully auditable by September, and I hope that that is the first step in a long process to drive the efficiencies of the Defense Department that we're all interested in.
Thank you, Ms. Mulvaney. And lastly, there's a 30% cut projected for the U.S. EPA. Have the impacts to the health of our water, of our air, been tabulated? The impacts that they will have on the health of our Americans in this country? And when we talk about grandkids, what does that mean? I have future grandkids coming. What is the impact to them when we have degraded regulations?
The gentleman, if you would, please answer that by written. As I say, you have 5 minutes, and so if you wait till the end, you're probably going to get your answer in writing. So if the director will answer that in writing, thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Faso, for 5 minutes.
Director, thank you for being here today, and thank you for your service to the country. I wanted to ask if you could clarify the Medicaid spending and the proposal. We are aware of the reduction in expected increase in Medicaid spending through the American Health Care Act, and there is some confusion as to how the calculation of that reduction in projected increase is also included within the President's budget proposal. I'm wondering if you could clarify this issue for me.
I can do my best, Mr. Faso, and if I don't satisfactorily do it, I'll be happy to meet with you outside or get it something to you in writing. But here's how I explain it to folks, is that the largest line item deals with the scored version of the American Health Care Act, which is all we had available to us when we started writing the budget. Keep in mind the budget, but by the way, for those of you, and I learned this the first time, the budget for 2019, we start work on that in September of 17. So that's how long the lead time is when you work on budget. So what we had available to us was the first scored version of the American Health Care Act, and that accounts for a big part of our Medicaid savings because that's how that budget, that proposal was scored. we added to that an additional change on the growth rates. We believe that the growth rate that's contained in the bill is actually higher than what we expect to see in the real world. So we propose a growth rate that we think is closer to actual growth rates in these types of costs. What you get when you do a couple of different things then, and the reason that so many folks talk about the $1.4 trillion numbers, if you have two large numbers, roughly, I'm going to round now, $800 billion in savings from one and $600 billion savings in another. Okay? But my point to you is that it is almost impossible for those two numbers to be added to get to 1.4 trillion because they contain within them the sum of the same factors.
There's double counting.
There's double counting. So what you'll end up is you're going to take the 800, some of the 800 is contained in the 600 and vice versa. So when you put them together and you actually have a proposal, it would never get as high as 1.4 trillion. I guess in theory it's possible, but it's highly unlikely. The number will be between 8 and 1.4.
Thank you. And I also appreciate your discussion about the debt. The CBO informed us earlier this year our debt is going to go from 19 trillion to 29 trillion in just 10 years. And so many of my friends on the other side believe that the problem is we're not taxing certain groups within our country enough. And I recently noted the Forbes 400. And if you calculated the net worth of all the Forbes 400, in other words, pretend we're Venezuela or the old Soviet Union for a second, and we just confiscate all of their net worth, not what they pay every year in taxes, but take all their money away from them. If you confiscated the net worth of the richest 400 people in America, all you would do is cover the federal budget deficit for about 4 years, and that's it. So I do think one of the problems in our country is that we're not speaking frankly to the American people as to the true nature of our debt and deficits. I wonder if you could comment also as to the risk in terms of servicing our national debt if we have a 1% increase in long-term interest rates, and what that would mean in terms of additional national debt service that we have to pay every year.
Sure, and to your previous point, what I like to tell people, if we could tax our way to growth and if we could tax our way to prosperity, every government in the world would have done it a long time ago. You simply can't do it. You have to figure out a way not to tax yourself into lack of growth. Regarding the 1%, it's fairly simple. When we talk about the $20 trillion debt, that's the total debt. We call total debt, gross debt, subject to the cap. Some of that obviously is contained within the Social Security system, the private debt. But the bottom line answer is, roughly speaking, 1% increase in long-term rates costs us $200 billion a year.
A year. So over a 10-year period, that's about $2 billion.
Would also make it the second largest line item in the budget after defense.
Lastly, the discussion of SNAP, and I also serve on agriculture, and I do want to see to make sure that people who are in need of food assistance are able to receive it. However, in our discussions in the Agriculture Committee, we learned this year that the taxpayers are paying $3 billion a year for folks on SNAP to buy soda, for which there is no nutritional benefit. I'm wondering what the administration's position might be if you've thought about this as trying to restrict SNAP to actually things that are nutritious rather than things that are not.
Congressman, in all fairness, it's an excellent point, and I don't know that we've given that some consideration. I'd be happy to talk to the Policy Council and get back with you on that.
Great, because there's $3 billion there you could probably save. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Mulvaney. You mentioned that the President promised that he would not cut Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. And after he won the election with the help of plenty of older Americans, I think we're seeing today a tremendous betrayal of that promise and of the people who rely on those programs. And I think it's in order to give enormous tax cuts to the wealthiest individuals and corporations. He never did say Social Security retirement. He said Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid. And the trust fund, the Social Security Trust Fund, has two major components: the OASI, Old Age and Survivor Insurance, and SSDI, the Social Security Disability Insurance. The contributions come from the same payroll tax. They go into the same Social Security Trust Fund and together make up what we know as the Social Security Program. Yet this budget makes dramatic changes to SSDI that would, among other things, cut the retroactive benefits that a serious disabled construction worker, for example, can receive for the time the Social Security Administration takes to work through its backlog of cases and finally give approval, which can take years. So, Mr. Mulvaney, when I'm asking yes or no, does the President's budget cut $72 billion from the Social Security Disability Insurance program?
I don't have the number in front of me, but yes, we do make reforms and reductions within the Social Security Disability Insurance program. A couple things. I think you may have.
Well, I'm sure your staff could provide you with the number, and that's really what I'm asking.
But you said the money goes into the same trust fund as old age. It does not. They are separate trust funds. So that's important to know because they're on different timelines. This is how I explain Social Security Disability Insurance, Ms. Schakowsky, which is that we also propose a paid parental leave program. We are running that, funding that through the unemployment insurance programs in the states, which is, by the way, the same way Canada does it. New York, New Jersey, California, one other state
Mr. Mulvaney, my time is so limited, and I'm not asking
but I'm happy
about
to ask,
that particular
no,
program.
You asked about SSDI, ma'am, and I'm happy to get to that. The point of the matter is that many states fund their parental leave through disability. We propose through unemployment insurance. Does that mean that having a baby is unemployment? No. Does it mean that having a baby is disability? No. It just happens to be that that is how the program is structured because the infrastructure is there. Social Security Disability is not Social Security. Social Security Disability Insurance is disability insurance. It's a welfare program for the disabled.
Okay. We disagree on that. I think most Americans disagree that Social Security Disability Insurance is part of that guaranteed program. Mr. Mulvaney, the President pledged not to cut Medicaid. Now, I just want to point out, we've dealt with this a little bit today, but we are talking about half the births in the United States, 30 million children, and half of all nursing home and long-term care nationwide for senior citizens and people with disabilities comes out of Medicaid. So it's really yes or no. Does the President's budget cut $1.3 trillion from Medicaid over 10 years?
I'll ask you a question, Congresswoman. When you say cut, are you speaking Washington or regular language?
Will the President's budget mean that Medicaid gets $1.3 trillion less than it would otherwise?
Then the CBO baseline score, the answer is yes. It will spend more money every single year over the previous year, with the exception I've mentioned. That, in my mind, is an increase in Medicaid spending.
Okay. I want to quote you, Mr. Mulvaney. You said that in regard to after-school programs, they're supposed to be educational programs, right? They're supposed to help kids who don't get fed at home, and so they do better in school. Guess what? There's no demonstrable evidence they're actually helping results, helping kids do better in school. The way we justified it was these programs are going to help these kids do better in school, and we can't prove that that's happening. This budget cuts the 21st Century Learning Program. It eliminates it entirely. And this is a program that does before school, after school, and summer programs that do include food for children. What the heck is going on?
Less than 20% of the children who enroll in that program actually move from not proficient to proficient. 20% is a failing
So
grade.
let's just not feed them.
How do we justify?
My time is up.
Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Lewis, for 5 minutes.
I would thank the chair and welcome Director Mulvaney. Glad to have you back in the Budget Committee. Let me start with a couple of quick questions and a short yes or no answer on a couple of these things, and then we'll get into a more substantive give and take a little bit. It's interesting to note, especially from the other side, that the first balanced budget in over 8 years, or in 8 years, has been greeted by moral outrage. Shockingly extreme, I think is the phrase I heard. Do you find it shockingly extreme that our debt has gone from $10.6 trillion to $19.9 trillion in just the last 8 years?
I absolutely do.
Do you find it shockingly extreme that we're mired in 1.9% growth over the next 10 years?
Frustratingly so, yes, sir.
Do you find it shockingly extreme that we've had record tax revenue last year, over $3.2 trillion, and yet we have a $600 billion deficit this year?
It's unacceptable.
Shockingly extreme that net interest expense is projected to be $768 billion, but if interest rates go back to their post-World War II average, 10-year Treasury at 5.7%, it'll be well over $1 trillion.
We'll be broke.
Shockingly extreme that the federal budget outlays has gone from $1 trillion in 1987 to $2 trillion in 2002 to $4 trillion today.
Growing much faster than every other measure of economic output.
Is it still shockingly extreme that federal revenue is above its 50-year average of 17.4% of GDP? Now it's at 17.8% of GDP, and yet we're told it's not enough?
It's never enough, is it?
Shockingly extreme that federal outlays are above their 50-year average of GDP, 20.3%. Today at 21%, scheduled to go to 23.4% of GDP.
Just unacceptable.
Federal debt held by the public, 77% of GDP, but actually total federal debt is almost 100% of GDP, correct? Is that shockingly extreme?
And going to have long-term detrimental economic impact on our economy.
And the civilian labor force participation rate back to 1977 levels at 62.8%?
But even lower than it should be given the graying of the American workforce population.
And finally, is it shockingly extreme that the top 25% of taxpayers, those households making $78,000 a year or more, two teachers making $40,000 a year, actually pay 87% of all income taxes collected?
Yeah, that's where the money is, right?
So in spite of all of the debt, all of the spending, all of the Keynesian stimulus, we are stuck at 1.9% growth. The CBO says it's going to be 1.9% growth for the next 10 years. And I'm wondering why that is, if that's all supposed to be so stimulative, and we're going to have the multiplier effect and demand-side economics is going to pull us out of this. Isn't the President's budget and what you're defending today an attempt to make certain that we grow at historical averages by not focusing on this pumping up or priming of demand, but getting investment and productivity back in the economy?
Private investment is what's going to save the country, because that is where innovation comes from, that's where productivity comes from, and that's where GDP growth comes from. We've tried it the other way. We've tried it with huge federal spending for the last 30 years. And now here we are where a large portion of the population, a large portion of this body thinks that 1.9% is the best we are going to ever be able to do. And that bespeaks a pessimism about the country that we simply refuse to accept.
And we've heard this notion of malaise. We're stuck in slow growth. We just can't move. Jimmy Carter talked about malaise. And yet we had 5 consecutive quarters after the pro-growth policies in the early 80s of 7% growth. Where's the empirical evidence that we can't grow at 3.5%?
No, I think the empirical evidence is that we can grow at 3%.
So the emphasis of this budget is to say we've got the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world at 35%. We've got $2.6 trillion in profits that could be repatriated. We've got a pass-through tax rate. Subchapter S, LLC, small businessman or woman, paying not 39.6%, but 44% when you take out the PEP and Ps and the itemized deductions. Lowering those tax rates is going to provide more capital, which is going to increase productivity. The truck driver, is it not true, Director Mulvaney, is always more productive with the truck?
Always.
And therefore, that's what this budget is supposed to do. And we've got data to show it's been done in the past, in the 60s, in the 80s, and even in the 90s.
Not only that, we need to do it to save the country.
In fact, without this sort of growth and this investment in productivity, we'll never balance the budget.
No, sir. Well, I take that back. At some point, we will balance the budget. The question is, do we do it on our terms or on someone else's? Because at some point, people will start to refuse to lend us money. And I'd much rather do it on our terms than somebody else's.
Thank you, Director Mulvaney. Good to see you again, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since, Mr. Mulvaney, you began the meeting by providing a better name for this budget, you described it as the taxpayer first budget. I describe it as the taxpayer shaft budget, because that's really what you're doing to millions and millions of people who simply are trying to make sure that they can keep their head above water and live a decent lifestyle. And I find irony in your lamenting that there's some kind of double counting in the total cost of the cuts in Trump care. Because let's be clear, this budget, as you described, does not balance. Hubris doesn't solve basic math problems. The Trump budget counts the savings from tax cuts and projects that these same tax cuts will stimulate growth in the economy and generate so much new revenue that it will produce $2.1 trillion in additional federal revenue. Now, you can't balance the budget by ignoring the reduction in revenue from tax cuts and then count the cuts as generating unprecedented, never-before-realized growth attributable to those tax cuts, and then trying to use that growth in revenue as a pay-for the tax cuts. That is what's called double counting. So let me give a real-life example. If I bought solar panels for my house and I reduced my electric bill through the savings by disconnecting from the grid, but then I didn't count the cost of the solar panels in my household budget and just ignored that there was a significant cost, and then I tried to also count the savings in my electric bill as an offset to the cost of the actual solar panels, then that would be double counting, particularly if I say that the offset is more than the cost of the solar panels. If I went to my accountant and said, my household budget using this configuration is balanced, he would laugh at me. Your Treasury Secretary, when confronted with the double counting, said that it was premature to put in any changes as a result of taxes since you're not far enough along to estimate what the impact would be. So, I mean, look, we can all go through this exercise, and that's certainly what we're doing. We can pretend that we're actually going to come up with a budget that we can all agree on and send to the President when we haven't done that in years. One thing, though, that is absolute certainty is that a budget is an expression of our values. And your values and your boss's values are appalling. If this is a reflection of our nation's values, then we really are in an internecine battle for the heart and soul of this country. So with that in mind, and I'd love to have you respond to that, I'll ask both my questions and then leave you the remaining time. 65% of seniors who rely on Medicaid to be able to afford a nursing home or nursing care in their homes do it through Medicaid. How can states continue to implement innovative programs to deliver long-term care to seniors and people with disabilities in their homes when you're taking $610 billion from them? So if you could answer both of those questions.
Sure, I can try.
Love to you just illuminate the committee on your math.
Yeah, and I'll start, Congresswoman, with the pushback on the never-before-realized growth. That's what's so depressing, is that people think that 3% growth is never before realized. It used to be an annual thing. And yet now here we are assuming that that's how we describe below average long-term growth in this country.
Please address the double counting.
Okay.
The double counting. That's my question.
Yeah, the double counting. Mr. Secretary Mnuchin was right. It is and was too early to make any assumptions about what the final tax bill looks like. We gave a set of principles to the House, and the House and the Senate are both looking at them right now.
So then, clearly, you representing that this budget is balanced is inaccurate.
No, it's not.
You can't both say it's premature and say that the budget balances.
I'd be more than happy to answer your question if you give me the chance, but I'm absolutely not suggesting that the budget balance is inaccurate. So if I may continue. We assumed, we had to make assumptions regarding what the tax bill would look like, right? There's three assumptions you can make. Either it adds to the deficit, subtracts from the deficit, or is deficit neutral. And we assumed, for sake of doing the budget, that it would be deficit neutral, that the removing the exclusions, the deductions, the loopholes would lead us to a deficit neutral tax plan. The dynamic benefit is only counted one time, and that's towards the 3% economic growth. And I'm happy to explain that to you further in writing if you like.
You can explain whatever you'd like. You are counting revenue twice and saying the budget is balanced, and anyone running their household budget that way would be in serious financial trouble down the road, as you are heading us towards.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Director.
Good morning.
As a previous small business owner, understand the need to balance a budget. Each year we had to match expenses to revenue, or you threaten the future of the company. And of course, as families, we need to do that on an annual basis as well. So I've talked about the federal budget in those terms. You know, we expect families, businesses to do that. Why can't we do that at the federal level? In the states, we've had a tool. We have a balanced budget amendment in Pennsylvania, served in the state Senate there. That required us to it imposed discipline on the process, if I will. But I brought this up spoke at a Rotary recently, and first question from a constituent said that the federal government's different. We cannot compare the two. We can't compare federal government to businesses because at federal government we can print money, so it's not the same thing. That's, by the way, very different than we had a hearing in this very room. CBO Director Hall was here, and he used a term called sovereign debt crisis. If we don't change the trajectory of our annual deficits, the growth in those deficits. So I'm curious, what is your thought on that? What happens if we continue down the path that we're on right now?
Well, let me speak to the point someone raised to you at the Rotary meeting, which is technically, I suppose they're right. You could simply print money, but what does that mean? What does that mean in the real world? It's not free to do that. If it were, we'd do it every single day, right? When we print money to pay off debts, when we print money to pay for things, what it essentially does is make the existing dollars in your pocket worth less. That's why they call inflation one of the cruelest taxes, especially on the older generations that have saved for retirement, now living off of their investments and so forth. So when you print money, you do nothing but essentially tax the people who are already there. It's a tax in a different form. So you can go back to your folks at Rotary and say, look, I guess you're probably right. Why don't you give me, say, 20% of the money in your pocket and we'll call it even? Because that's what it would take to effectively balance the budget. Actually, I think the number this year is going to be about 14%. But where are we headed? We're headed to where I talked about before, which is we will balance the budget eventually, one way or the other, on our terms or on somebody else's, either by balancing the budget the proper way, printing a bunch of money that impoverishes our citizens, or having somebody else who won't lend us money force certain considerations on us in order to get us to balance as a condition to lending us money. Only one of those outcomes is desirable, Congressman, and that is the one about figuring out a way to do it ourselves before it's too late.
Which requires tough decisions. But I want to also, as a business owner, I saw the real impact. We talk about 3%, 2%, 1% growth, and when you're just talking figures, it doesn't seem like a lot, but we had about 150 employees in our business, and I've been through times of recession, times of low economic growth, and the jobs just weren't available. We were a construction company. And so, small enough company, we knew the employees, we knew the families, and saw the impact when we had to tell people we just simply don't have enough work and had to lay people off. And, I'm one of the reasons that I think we're all here is to provide opportunity for our kids, our grandkids, to help lift people out of poverty, provide that economic mobility. And I think the best possible thing that we can do is have a higher economic growth that will provide that opportunity. I'd just like to hear your response to that.
I'm interested to hear the story about your family. My family was in the home building business. And one of the things, my dad has turned 75 this year, and one of the things I think he's most proud of is the number of folks who are making more than $100,000 at his company, this is 20 years ago now, that didn't have a college degree. In fact, many of them didn't have a high school degree. Because you could make that kind of living in a healthy American economy in the construction business. And I think that growth cures so many ills. Bill Clinton gave more people, gave being the wrong verb, but provided health insurance for more people than Hillary Care would have simply by having economic growth. It solves so many of our problems. In fact, would probably cure a lot of the ills between the two parties because it's a lot more fun to govern in a growing economy than it is in a sluggish one.
I think there's a lot we can agree on here in both parties. But I do want to mention one other aspect of the budget, and this was brought up. Our nation faces a growing heroin opioid epidemic that is shattering the lives of families in my district and devastating communities across the nation. This public health crisis claimed the lives of more than 3,383 Pennsylvanians and 33,000 Americans in 2015 alone, and it's getting worse. I sent you a letter last week, which I'd like to submit to the record, Madam Chair, if I could.
Without objection.
And I, again, laud you for recognizing the severity of this crisis and for prioritizing life-saving investments into the Office of the National Drug Policy. I wonder if you could explain to the members of this committee just exactly how the President's budget request increases the federal government's response to the opioid crisis.
I can, Congressman. I see that my time has expired, but I'd be more than happy to both talk to you about that and handle that in writing.
Appreciate that.
Madam Chair, if I may be so bold, would it be possible to take like a 90-second break?
Absolutely
Thank
would.
you.
Let's take a 90-second break for the committee. You're next. After the 90 seconds.
Intentional to have John out in the morning, but when Miss Jayapal read that statement, it sounded angry and harsh. And I was thinking, I just can't even imagine.
Jason, are we just taking a break here?
90-second break.
Hey, I want to do all this stuff.
The committee will come to order. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for 5 minutes. Oh, excuse me. I think that I did not. Excuse me, Mr. Woodall. I need to go to the Democrat side. I apologize. I'm incorrect. You are next. I now recognize Ms. Jackson Lee from Texas for 5 minutes. Apologize.
Mr. Mulvaney, you indicated in your statement that reducing lower priority non-defense discretionary spending was going to be a core of this budget's success. I interpret that as a betrayal of the children, seniors, working families, people who voted for Trump, cities, counties, and states. That is the interpretation that I believe the American people will understand. In the course of your budget, you have gutted or cut the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and something that the Gulf region needs desperately. Coming from South Carolina, you should understand the Army Corps of Engineers. You repealed the Affordable Care Act, but $880 billion, that is your premise. When the Senate said that that repeal is dead on arrival, they said the budget was dead on arrival. You're going to eliminate Community Services Block Grant. You're going to eliminate Community Development Block Grant. You're going to eliminate Federal Emergency Management Agency, state and local grants. all lifelines for Americans. I won't have to worry about shutting the government down because Americans will shut this government down if the Trump betrayal budget ever passes. So let me ask you these questions, and as I do so, let me remind my fellow Texans that they get $70 billion from the federal government for their budget, and they just balance their budget on the $70 billion from the United States government, federal government, of which you will eliminate. I also want to put on the record that the trips that Trump takes to Mar-a-Lago in the past 5 months cost $20 million. If we keep going at this rate, it will be in 4 years, $200 million. I would like to suggest that one of the things you do is to cut not only his trips to Mar-a-Lago, but his trips overseas, because you're cutting $9 billion from the State Department. So my question to you involves the Army Corps of Engineers, why you would be so much against the important flood work that counties like mine need. Number one. The other question is, I want to ask about a letter you wrote last week to the Director of Office of Government Ethics, Walter Shaw. The letter appears an effort to try and shut down the investigation of Trump giving waivers to so many billionaires who's working in his administration, number one. Number two. Number three, you have a comment, that doesn't mean we should take care of the person who sits at home and eats poorly and gets diabetes. Are you saying that you support a health care plan that makes distinctions between the deserving ill and the undeserving ill in deciding who can get federal support and how much? Is that why you have the audacity to cut $880 billion out? My third question is, Director Mulvaney, is it reasonable to assume that the budget includes a $1.4 trillion or more in cuts to Medicaid? And I just met with the state of Texas. They are begging for their Medicaid so they can provide for the poor in their state. I'd appreciate you asking the question, and would you answer the question, are you betraying those who voted for Trump looking for a lifeline, and are you betraying the American people?
Thank you, Congressman. In reverse order, are we betraying the American people? No. In fact, we believe that getting them to 3% growth is giving them exactly what they wanted when they elected this president. Is it true or untrue to state that we cut $1.4 trillion from Medicaid? That is untrue for the reasons I've stated earlier. Regarding my statement last week on diabetes, I was speaking at a health care conference. What I was trying to do is draw a distinction between type 1 and type 2.
But you did say it.
Again, I'm trying to put my comments into context, ma'am. I'm aware of the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. On the OGE...
But you're not a doctor either.
I'm not a doctor. Are you?
I know diabetes. It's in my family and it's in my community, and it particularly impacts African Americans, and we will be devastated by this budget along with working families.
Regarding the OGE letter, I got a letter from the Office of Government Ethics that I thought was inappropriately broad and violative of statute, so I did what I think is the exact right thing to do when there's a dispute between two pieces of the executive branch. We referred the matter to the Department of Justice and the Office of Legal Counsel, which I think is the statutory thing I'm supposed to do. Regarding infrastructure, we are, as I've mentioned before,
Army Corps of
earlier
Engineers.
question, the Army Corps of Engineers writ large with infrastructure is that we are trying to focus our attention on getting to the $1 trillion worth of new infrastructure, leveraging $200 billion of new spending.
Your budget is full of tricks and trickery. It does not work. No economist will approve your budget in terms of it working. There will not be a 3% growth because the working population is expired. This is a betrayal of the American people. Thank you. I yield back.
Expired. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the director for being here. I remember when he was a young freshman, I was a young freshman. In fact, our current chairwoman, Ms. Black, was a young freshman, and we got here having just been elected in that giant class of 2010, and the first thing we got to do was write the budget. And oh golly, what an amazing honor that is. You get elected to serve your folks back home, and you get to come up here and start making priorities. And I remember that first moment, and I suspect you remember it too, Mr. Mulvaney, when you realize the budget doesn't actually get signed into law, that the changes that you make don't actually become the new law of the land, that the conversations that we have here are simply about vision and not about how policy is going to change tomorrow. Do you remember that moment of realization?
Realization is a positive spin to put on it, yes, Mr. Woodall.
I ask you that because I heard my friend from Florida, say that your values are appalling, and I apologize for that. We're not talking about your values here. I know you. I know you to be a man of integrity, and you're exactly the right guy to have in this job. We are talking about choices. I think in the ranking member's opening statement, as read by Ms. Jayapal, it was said that these are false choices, that we don't have to choose. What I hear you saying is that, in the spirit of finding reputable economists, that you cannot find a reputable economist that says continuing as we are continuing is a recipe for success. Is that accurate?
Not a single one. No, I don't think you'll find any reputable economist that says we can do what we're doing forever.
Well, and in fact, over the last 8 years, we haven't been making choices. It's hard to make these choices, but in all of the doom and gloom conversation about cuts, explain it to me in simple terms that I can understand. Exactly which year, going from one year to the next, are you going to spend less money on behalf of the American people?
Not one.
Let me make sure I'm understanding you. You're saying that in all of this conversation about the cuts and the erosion of public spending, you're spending more every single year proposed in this budget?
Yes, sir.
I know that there's more that unites this country than that divides it. And I believe we can find that pathway forward together. If I could put a slide up here on the screen, this is what I have seen in my short time in Congress. This is CBO projected growth, and of course OMB has one projection of growth. CBO has a separate projection of growth. But time and time again in this committee hearing, I've heard folks say that your projection of 3% growth is just outrageous, that it's unsubstantiated, that absolutely no one would ever agree that such a thing was possible. As I look back on my chart, even we here in Congress agreed that such a thing was not only possible, but probable just 5 years ago. When you talk about 3% growth going out on the horizon, is that the same 3% growth that CBO was projecting just a short time ago?
And other administrations, previous administrations, were actually projecting higher than that.
Now, when you move from 1.9% economic growth to 3% GDP growth, what does that translate into in terms of revenues to the federal government?
Oh, I can't remember what the top line number is, Congressman, but it's a substantial sum. Remember the difference between 2% growth, and I always cringe when people say when you go from 2% growth to 3% growth, that's only a 1% increase. It's not. It's a 50% increase.
So my understanding of that revenue means we'd be looking at something close to a balanced budget. If these numbers had stayed at 3%, going back to the time you and I got started, we'd be looking at a balanced budget today. So significant would be that revenue.
I have seen studies that, based on what assumptions you want to make, that would say you're very, very close to getting there. What I have heard the President say, and what I'd like to hear from you, is that every single thing that he is doing is geared towards returning us to these 3% growth figures. Is that accurate? Every single thing that he is doing is geared towards getting us back to 3% growth.
There is not one family in my district that doesn't believe that's going to make a difference. I'll close with this. You all just sent a $10 million check to the state of Georgia to rebuild a bridge that collapsed in our district. There was a fire, 12 lanes of interstate collapsed. We rebuilt it in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, a performance budget going out to that contractor. There is not a conservative family in my district that was not proud to pay their tax dollar to go to that project because they got value for that dollar. Thank you for trying to squeeze those dollars and bring that pride back in what we do together.
And I would encourage you to look at the permit process that was necessary to build that in 6 weeks. It would stun you as to how much time we spend permitting.
I thank the gentleman.
Ms. Delbany.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Mulvaney, for being here with us today. My background is as a businesswoman and an entrepreneur, and I know how incredibly important it is to have a budget that's responsible. And I must say that this budget is incredibly irresponsible and dangerous. It would be an enormous setback in pretty much every area that affects American families, particularly for children, seniors, and people with disabilities. It would have a negative impact on critical research, on health care, job training, our environment, affordable housing programs, education, and that's just to name a few. rather than gouging programs and important programs that the middle class relies on just in order to give the wealthiest Americans a tax break. We should be working on a bipartisan budget. That's what works, a bipartisan budget that provides working families certainty and stability. And so let's start with farmers. Under your budget, more than 5,200 positions at USDA would be eliminated. This is part of a larger 8% cut. The Farm Service Agency alone, which my farmers rely on for critical assistance, would lose 973 people. USDA Rural Development would lose 925 employees, and on and on. This was a bad idea when it was proposed in the past, and it's still a bad idea. What's the rationale for making a farmer drive hours out of his or her way to get to one FSA office that's open 3 counties away because you decided that rural America is doing just fine as it is? And farmers lead incredibly busy lives, and making their lives more difficult through cuts like this is incredibly short-sighted. So why are we cutting important programs for
Congressman,
farmers?
I appreciate the question, and I have received some questions about some of the farm supplement and subsidy programs. I've not received that exact question before, so I apologize if I'm only going to be able to give you half an answer, and I'm not satisfied with half an answer, so I want to give you a full answer in writing afterwards. But I'm looking at my notes very quickly on a topic I'm not as familiar with as some of the other things, and I see that the farm loan programs are up $564 million in the budget. So I'm not saying
the Farm Service Agency alone would lose 973 people, and we already know that access is hard. I've heard that from my farmers directly. I just heard it from a farmer last night, so I'd appreciate more information on that.
And I apologize for not having it at the top of my head. So
this budget would also cut the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, by $6 billion, which is a truly stunning and irresponsible cut. In the last few years, Congress has worked on a bipartisan basis to boost NIH funding by nearly $4 billion. And I'd remind you that federal funding for NIH supports more than 400,000 American jobs and generates more than $60 billion in new economic activity. Unfortunately, the federal government's contribution towards basic research at the NIH have consistently failed to keep pace with inflation, which has allowed the agency's purchasing power to diminish by nearly 20% since the year 2003. So if we're serious about breaking new ground in our understanding of complex and life-threatening conditions, then it's absolutely essential that we increase funding for the NIH. We can't hope to accelerate development for new cures, therapies, vaccines without additional resources for research. And these need to be consistent, stable resources. We just agreed through the end of this year to make sure we increase funding for NIH in a bipartisan fashion. So why can we not support bipartisan ideas, important ideas that have a positive impact on our economy and a positive impact on our communities in terms of the innovation and the impact it would have on people's lives? I'd like to understand your rationale for setting back medical progress and research across many critical areas.
Sure, and I think we probably can agree on more than you realize, Congresswoman. I don't know if you were here when I answered a similar question from Congressman Cole earlier, but the administration wholeheartedly believes in the commitment to research. We'd like to see more focus on what they call basic research, which is research further away from the marketability of products, because that is one of the gaps that the government can and should fill. When you look at the long lead time on developments of new drugs, for example, many companies cannot
And that's
afford.
why consistent dollars are important. And so
Absolutely
here we've
is.
had continuing resolutions, and we disrupt that ability for scientists to see their research. Partial research doesn't work. You have to, if you're going to fund something, it's got to be funded all the way through. We're running out of time, and so I just want to say this is critically important. It's a bipartisan issue, something we agree on. You're cutting dollars. You're not adding dollars, and I think we've got to focus on that.
3 seconds, if you look at the way we propose to spend the money, we can actually spend as much money research next year as we did last year.
I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Ferguson.
Director, thank you for coming today. And it's interesting as I sit here and listen to a lot of the comments on both sides, but particularly from those here on the left, it reminds me so much of where I was just a few years ago in my hometown. I lived and had come from a hometown and governed in a hometown that lost its manufacturing backbone. We lost tens of thousands of textile jobs, and no matter in the coming decade, the decade and a half after that, no matter how many government programs the communities relied on, no matter how much public assistance went to those in poverty, education, community block grants, no matter what those small wins may have looked like, you could not pour enough money into the problem to address those issues. It simply did not change until we created the environment for advanced manufacturing to call our community home. And it's when we put 16,000 to 17,000 people back to work that we really begin to see our fortunes change. It changed our city budgets that we had to cut doing the same things that we're doing now, really programs that communities value, but we simply did not have the mechanism to pay for. It wasn't until we grew our local economy, that we grew our city revenues and cut taxes, that we were actually able to have the revenues needed to put back into those important programs that our community wanted. So with that, the things that we had to do is we had to create the right tax environment. We had to have the right regulatory environment where we partnered with our industry, not penalized it. We had to have an education system that developed a viable workforce, and we had to make strategic public investments in infrastructures to support it. So with that, I'll ask these very few questions. Does this budget, and is it the desire of the president to do those things, create the right tax environment for business?
Absolutely.
Create the right regulatory environment?
Drives everything we do.
Create the right education environment that really prepares people for a job in the 21st century economy?
Sir.
Does it create strategic public investments in infrastructure that allow the public sector to come in behind it and dwarf the public investment?
One of the reasons we talk about increasing spending on infrastructure.
If we do all of those things, can we in fact get above 3% GDP growth?
Yes.
If we do that, can we develop the resources that we need to build a bridge to really effectively deal with what is ultimately the biggest cost driver in the budget, and that's the mandatory spending curve?
Yeah, as I said before, I think you're moving to a point where you won't be able to balance the budget if you don't address mandatory programs.
Okay. If we are able to do that, if we are able to have significant deficit reduction, or at least be neutral as this budget does, I think it's important that we recognize that we're fighting over a small part of the budget. If we want to make those strategic investments in these programs that our members on both sides of the aisle feel are valuable, we have to address the mandatory spending curve. There is no doubt about it. We have to address issues with Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and interest on the debt. And typically when those conversations are had, the first thing that happens is one side or the other throws up some wild headline that says, hey, old Bergman over here or Ms. Wasserman Schultz wants to cut your Social Security or Medicare. We need to have an honest conversation with the American public about where that is and where we are headed. And every single member of Congress has an obligation to address those programs in such a way that we protect those that are receiving them now, those that are close to the finish line, but be very transparent about the fact that we're going to have to change something long term, and we're going to have to create enough economic activity to be able to build that bridge to get us from where we are right now until when those program changes can actually go into effect.
And I think it's absolutely valuable, Congressman, that you have the perspective of somebody who is either a councilman or a mayor, judging by what you mentioned, that folks who have to balance a budget at the town level and the city level get it. Folks that have to balance a budget at the state level get it, and for some reason this body, and I count myself amongst it because I was one of you until recently, we just don't get it. And I don't know why we lose that common sense approach, where that reasoned look at economics and life goes away because somehow we get elected to Congress. So I appreciate that input. It's extraordinarily refreshing. I want to clarify one thing I said before, get a chance, because I hate being wrong on numbers. I've probably done it more than once. But I got asked earlier the size of the non-defense discretionary budget versus the mandatory. I think I said mandatory was 72%. 66 is what my staff told me is the right number. But either way you look at it, it is the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
There is no greater program that we can give our American people than the dignity of work.
Thank you. Mr. Jeffries.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Mulvaney, for your presence and for your service. The Trump budget balances itself on the backs of working families, middle-class folks, senior citizens, the poor, the sick, the afflicted, as well as rural America. It does this, in my humble opinion, largely to just provide a massive tax cut to the wealthiest 1 or 2% of the people in this great country. That's reckless and that's irresponsible. Now, the Trump budget, as proposed, balances itself and eliminates the deficit in 10 years. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And part of the reason why it's able to balance itself is that it assumes that there will be increased revenue in the amount of $2 trillion connected to exponentially more significant job growth. Is that right?
It assumes that if you're referring to the GDP growth, because I don't know if we talk about full-time. We do
economic growth. Yeah,
it's economic growth. We do have some numbers on their unemployment as well. But yes, you're correct that
now,
we do assume additional government revenues through economic growth.
And that's $2 trillion in additional revenue, not $2 million or $2 billion, $2 trillion in additional revenue. Is that right?
I think that's right. Yes, sir. 2.1, I can't remember the exact number.
And the projected economic growth of approximately 3% is due in large measure to the theory that significant tax cuts disproportionately benefiting the wealthy and the well-off will stimulate the economy. Is that right?
Congressman, that's part of it. When we looked at the CBO baseline of 1.9, the way that we moved towards 3.0 included tax reform, but it also included regulatory reform, which we think actually can have a larger impact on GDP. It included our trade policies, our infrastructure spending. So there was a basket of policies that we think moved us from 1.9 to 3.0.
But it's fair to say that a substantial part of the theory as to the increased economic growth is anchored in your strong, authentic, principled belief in tax cuts. Is that right?
Again, it depends on what your definition of substantial part is. We also assumed the repeal of Obamacare, which the CBO said actually added 0.1% to economic growth.
Okay, there's no scintilla of evidence, certainly for the last 25 years, that tax cuts, in part, are responsible for stimulating any meaningful economic growth. Is that fair?
No.
Okay, well, let's look at the record, at least at the federal government level. Bill Clinton was president for 8 years, and during his 8-year presidency, there was substantial economic growth. Is that correct?
That is a true statement, yes, sir.
And the tax rate when Bill Clinton came into office was at 31%, correct?
I don't remember the tax rate, Congressman.
Okay, we can stipulate the highest tax rate. It's easily ascertainable, 31%. He immediately, with the support of Congress, changed that top tax rate from 31% to 39.6%, correct?
Again, Congressman, I don't remember. I was not paying much attention to national politics in the mid-1990s.
Okay, and 20 million plus jobs were created during the 8 years of the Clinton presidency, true?
I believe there was substantial economic growth. I don't remember the number of jobs.
Okay, George Bush was elected president in 2000, correct?
That is correct.
And the top tax rate at the time was 39.6%, true?
Again, Congressman, I take you at your word.
Okay, thank you. And the Bush tax cuts that were put into place in 2001 and 2003 resulted in the top tax rate being dropped from 39.6% to 35%, correct?
I think that's correct.
And how would you characterize economic growth and job creation during the Bush presidency?
Congressman, if you're trying to get me to say that the cause of the Clinton economic boom was an increase in taxes, and that the cause of the recession of 2008 was a decrease in taxes, you're just not going to get me to go there. If we could tax our way to prosperity, we would have done it a long time ago.
I'm just asking a factually based question. Actually, during the 8 years of the Bush presidency, when the top tax rate was dropped, this country lost 400,000 jobs. Now, during the subsequent 8 years, we've got, again, 25 years of a record here. Barack Obama comes into office, the top tax rate is 35%. It's raised to 39.6%. And during the Obama presidency, 12 million private sector jobs were created. I simply say that there is no evidence anchored in any reality as to this theory of dynamic scoring and trickle-down economics yielding substantial economic growth? I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. Gentleman for California, Mr. McClintock, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Director, welcome. I'd like to continue that very line of analysis. As I recall, Bill Clinton reduced federal spending by 4% of GDP. He approved what amounted to the biggest capital gains tax cut in American history. He overhauled entitlement spending, in his words, ending welfare as we knew it, and we did have a period of profound economic expansion.
As I recall, over his objection and at the insistence of a Republican-controlled Congress.
And I understand that the growth assumptions are at issue here, but the growth assumptions, which are very relevant to whether and when the budget balances, are really irrelevant to the policies that are required to produce that growth, are they not?
Policies will drive everything, yes, sir.
And with respect to the policies, this budget reminds me a great deal of the first Reagan budget, when he rebuilt our defenses, restrained the growth of non-defense spending, enacted the tax and regulatory reforms that were necessary to grow the economy, where wages are growing and opportunity to prosper expands to include every American. What was the result of these policies that you are restoring to our federal fiscal plan?
We built an American economy that was the envy of the entire world, and can be again if we can have the sense to reinstill some of those same policies.
In fact, we averaged 3.5% growth every year for 8 years, compared to the Obama policies that increased taxes, increased the regulatory burdens, increased our deficits dramatically, and produced one of the slowest growth rates in the history of the country. I believe we averaged 1.5% every year for his 8 years. Is that correct?
I think that sounds right, Congressman. In addition, I think in his very first budget, he assumed that he would get 3.5% growth, 4.4% growth, 4.6% growth, and 3.8% growth.
And when Reagan took office, the top marginal income tax rate was 70%, getting to the question of these terrible tax cuts for the very wealthy. Top rate was 70% when Reagan took office. He cut that rate from 70% down to 28%. And the result was our income tax revenues went from $285 billion to $456 billion in the same period. Is that correct?
Again, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I will take you as your word, as I did with the previous Congress.
And the share of taxes paid by that top 1% actually went up dramatically from 17.6% to 27.6%. So when we cut the top marginal tax rate, the economy expanded dramatically, revenues to the federal government expanded dramatically, and the proportion of taxes paid by the wealthy actually increased. It didn't decrease.
And don't forget, President Reagan also dramatically simplified the tax plan, which is something we're talking about doing as well.
So this isn't theory, this is practice, and it's been practiced under both Democratic and Republican administrations. When you cut the tax and regulatory burdens, the economy expands. We saw that under Reagan, we saw that under Clinton, we saw that under Coolidge and Harding, we saw that under John F. Kennedy. These are the plans that actually work. This isn't theory, this is long-standing practice, and it is so good to see an administration returning to the policies that work, and for the first time in 16 years, having a president who actually gives a damn about balancing the budget before it bankrupts the country. And that's the one point I wanted to differ with you on. You said that if we continue down this path, our grandchildren will have $30–40 trillion of debt on their shoulders. I don't think we get that far. You mentioned a sovereign debt crisis. When the government loses access to capital, pension systems implode, basic services, including public safety, falter. Ultimately, you have runaway inflation and the economy collapses. I asked a leading economist with Mercatus, how long do we have? And his answer was, well, you can't really make a prediction like that because a number of different factors will influence the onset of a sovereign debt crisis. But he says, I can tell you this. When we reach $1 trillion a year in annual deficits, the markets will be destabilized at that point, and you will set the stage for a sovereign debt crisis. Your budget turns us away from that bleak future. But that day comes, according to the Congressional Budget Office, if we don't change course 5 years from now. We don't have a lot of time left.
And I hope the House Budget Committee takes your words to heart as well, Congressman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, will be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, thank you very much for joining us here today. I'd like to touch on your comment about Washington speak versus regular language for the American people. Director, do you believe in inflation?
I believe that it's very real, yes, sir.
Do you believe in population growth?
I do, yes, sir.
Okay, so I think that people back home understand that if you flatline budgets for things like Medicare, Medicaid, that, you know, let's say my parents are counting on getting cataract surgery so they don't go blind today. But if there's enough money in the budget to cover them both today, and that budget is flatlined going forward, and the price of cataract surgery goes up, or there are simply more people in America who need that surgery, then they won't be both covered in the future. One of my parents will go blind. That's why in Washington we account for inflation and population growth when we do budgeting. I think people back home understand that the cost of bread is not the same today as it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago because of inflation. And I'm concerned that in the same way that you're returning us to the failed President Bush policies of tax cuts to spur economic growth that when only directed at the wealthiest don't in fact spur any economic growth at all, that we're getting back to the fuzzy math of the Bush era as well. But I would like to talk for a second about your cuts to the State Department. General Mattis in 2013, who was then commander of U.S. Central Command, said before Congress that if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. And that, quote, the more that we put into the State Department's diplomacy, hopefully the less we have to put into a military budget as we deal with the outcome of an apparent American withdrawal from the international scene. Do you agree with his assessment, Mr. Director?
That's the question this way, Congressman. What you see there is the President doing exactly the same thing he's done on other line items in the budget that I've talked about today. I recognize the fact there are folks in this room who do not appreciate or support the reductions in the State Department line item, just like there's folks over on this side of the room who probably do not agree with our decision not to tackle Social Security and Medicare.
Director, I'm actually not talking about members of Congress. I'm talking about our own Secretary of Defense.
What I'm answering you this way is that this is what the President promised he would do. I understand what Secretary Mattis said before he was.
Well, the President also promised he wouldn't cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and he is cutting them. He also promised us a health care plan that would see everybody get beautiful coverage, and that's not what we're getting from the AHCA, which in fact is guaranteeing that a lot of people, like my parents, will see their health care costs go up over the next 10 years if it's passed.
Come back to your basic assumption, Congressman, though, which is that the government must grow. That's what the CBO baseline says, that you are required to grow at inflation plus population growth. And I think there's many of us who simply reject that. There is no reason that the government must, on autopilot,
Mr. Director,
grow
I
would
would love to see the government not grow because we get more efficient. I share your belief that we ought to be able to achieve that. But I'm not going to dismiss inflation. I'm not going to dismiss population growth when we talk about budgeting. Now, Director Mulvaney, do you disagree with the statement of General David Petraeus, former CIA director, retired General John Allen, retired Admiral James Stavridis, and 120 other retired generals and admirals who expressed their opposition, just like Secretary Mattis, to cuts in diplomatic programs? They said the State Department, USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, Peace Corps, and other development agencies are critical to preventing conflict and reducing the need to put our men and women in uniform in harm's way. Do you disagree with that assessment?
Yes, sir. I don't necessarily agree with that, and the budget does not agree with that.
But why do you disagree with that? It sounds an awful like our president, who says that he's smarter than the generals. Is that your view?
What you're seeing?
There's 120 respected generals who say you're wrong. Your own Secretary of Defense says you're wrong. So why is it that you're willing to put our troops at risk by cutting aid to diplomatic programs that keep them out of harm's way. Why is that? That is not fair to our troops. That is not fair to those of us who are on the ground. Mr. Director, with all due respect. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back. Let's see. Mr. Sanford, gentleman from South Carolina, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank the Director as well for his time here. I want to say how much I applaud your goal of balancing a budget. As already been noted, the last administration did not have that as a goal. It didn't balance in perpetuity. I very much admire that. I admire your willingness to make cuts, both in taxes and in spending. We've had much conversation on the Appalachian Regional Commission because you've actually proposed cuts, and it's something a lot of administrations have not proposed. I admire you. We've worked together over any number of different years in different capacities. I think you're bright, capable, and caring.
Have to write that down?
Yeah, I will. I will. And I generally sympathize with the fact that you're doing an executive branch budget, which I did for 8 years of my life, and that's a difficult process. But, and I will go to the but, I want to go back to what we talked about yesterday. You have said that the foundation of your budget is 3% growth. And I have looked every which way at how you might get there, and you can't get there. And as a consequence, I think it is just disastrously consequential to build a budget on 3% budget. The Bible says you can't build a house on a sandy foundation. What it does is it perpetuates a myth that we can go out there and balance the budget without touching entitlements. It's not only a myth, it's frankly a lie. And if it gets started at the executive branch level, it moves from there. And so I think that this notion of 3%, I heard literally the Speaker of the House talking today about the notion of 3% growth and how we can balance the budget. I just, again, as earnestly as I have looked at this, I don't know how you get there. And what this does is it creates real debates from happening. I mean, legitimately, myself and Democratic colleagues can see things quite differently. But for us to have a real debate, we have to base it on real numbers. I would also say it's important because I'm a deficit hawk, as you well know. And if you're wrong on these numbers, it means all of a sudden we've created a $2+ trillion hole for our kids and grandkids here going forward. So I want to walk through a couple of different numbers with you. One, this budget presumes a Goldilocks economy. And I think that that's a very difficult thing on which to base a budget. If you look at the average economic expansion in the history of our country, it's 58 months. The current expansion that we're in is actually the third longest economic expansion in American history. We're at 94 months. But what you presume in this budget is not only will we not have a recession, though we're in the third longest economic expansion in history, but it's going to keep going for another 214 months. It's not only unprecedented, I would think that to be unreasonable. It assumes that the stars perfectly align with regard to economic drivers. Can you guess the last time we had an unemployment rate of 4.8%, growth at 3%, and inflation held at 2%? It's never happened. The last time that growth was at 3%, we held for a sustained period of time the 10-year bond yield below 5%. You all presume 3.8%. Can you guess the last time that's ever happened?
Again, I'm trusting you on the assumptions.
Yeah, it's never happened. So we're going way out there on the curve in terms of assumption. And then in terms of the ingredients of growth, I actually broke out some numbers here. You know, capital formation would have to go to the record level that we've seen in terms of capital growth from 1965 to 1974, though capital formation actually goes down as people retire. They withdraw from the savings accounts. Labor force growth would have to go to see what we saw in the 1970s and 80s when women were joining the workforce en masse. And even if you include the labor participation rates, took them back up to the numbers that we saw in the 1990s, we would see a 0.2%, a decimal increase, not a percentage increase. It would require either radically opening immigration or a radical change to demographics, as we are having 10,000 baby boomers retire each day. If you look at productivity growth, it would require numbers, again, that we haven't seen since the golden days of 1958 to 1967 in the final wave of electrification, consumer appliance, and the completion of the highway system to achieve what we're seeing. Even if we went to 1990 numbers, we would only see 1/4 of what is necessary to achieve 3% growth, though the RAND Corp says that a reduction of 15% is to be presumed with aging. I would just lastly submit this for the record, which is to say, if you look at the correlation between OMB and CBO
Entered
budgets,
for the record without objection. I'm sorry, the gentleman's time's expired.
All right. To be
Gentlewoman
continued.
from New Mexico, Ms. Lauren Grisham, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Director. That wasn't the strategy I was going to take, but maybe I can finish up just a little bit of what my colleague, Mr. Sanford, was hitting on. This committee, as you well know, it's very difficult for us to have and I mean no disrespect to my colleagues, and I don't think that you mean any disrespect to us on this side of the Budget Committee either, but we don't have these earnest dialogues about how you might look at this and what your priorities could or should be. And I agree. If we want to have kind of a Cadillac growth in the economy and GDP, you want that, and you want to get kind of a balanced perspective about who thinks that can happen. Do comprehensive immigration reform. Now, we might disagree about the policies related to that, but I think it's going to be very hard for members of this committee to disagree that in fact, will grow the economy. You want to make sure that government is lean and efficient. You want to make sure that we're not hoarding money or not being accountable. Well, let's deal with $125 billion at the Pentagon. There are things that we can do. If we're concerned about population issues that are very expensive, boy, I spent a lot of time doing aging policy. It's a very delicate effort here. You want dignity and respect and quality of life for older Americans, but we recognize unequivocally that they are chronically ill. They're on an average of 7 medications. Most of them need long-term care, including my mother, who, by the way, is only 77. And the amount that we spend unsustainable. So if we're interested in that, then you bet. Get NIH and CDC and every research arm and institution, public or private, in the United States, and get them to prevent and cure Alzheimer's. And we've got a boon to the economy, and we have lowered our risks. And I realize that particularly the last one, there's not a one of us here who doesn't wish we could do that and eliminate all chronic disease, but we aren't going to invest in addressing that at all. And in fact, we're saying, look, because there has to be sacrifices to deal with a balanced budget and to really address some serious issues, we're just going to have one side of the American population. You sacrifice, and everybody else. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how I'm living that. NBC News just put out a report. I'll submit it for the record if that's...
Without objection.
I will then. And here it is. It says, look, New Mexico would be hit the hardest. All right? So I'm living in a state that's using many of these trickle-down economic and cut policies, agendas that are clearly embedded in this budget document. And let me tell you a little bit about and we're a defense state with 2 labs, right? So a lot of the stuff that you're proposing should really work in a state like ours, except NBC says not so much. And let's talk about my state. And if you remember from being on this committee, I talk about it a lot because it's a huge problem. 10 years ago, we had a 3.7 unemployment rate. Today, we have the highest unemployment rate in the nation at 6.7% for the 3rd month in a row. Our graduation rate is the worst in the nation, with only 69% of our students graduating on time. 20% of New Mexicans live in poverty. 28% of New Mexico children live in poverty, 2nd highest in the nation. Half the state is on Medicaid with some of the worst health care outcomes, 2nd for infectious disease, 4th for teen pregnancy, 3rd for suicide, 1st for chronic liver disease, 8th for drug overdose. 1/3 of New Mexicans rely on SNAP and nutrition assistance. Half of New Mexico's children under 4 are, in fact, receiving state or SNAP benefits. Now, we might argue about, well, see, Medicaid's not working, but we have a governor that's actually been cutting Medicaid and being more draconian about work requirements and not being very smart about reinvesting. Cut, trickle-down economics, which in fact have driven out businesses. We have the highest teacher vacancy rates in the country. I could spend way more than just the 40 seconds I have left to tell you that we're the only state losing population. People have lost hope, and in fact, embedded in every decision that our current conservative leadership, both at the local level and at the state level, have made mirror many of the priorities in this budget, with none of the outcomes that you project for the nation's economy. So I'd like to just point to a different perspective, that while states are working to get ahead and balance these issues and sacrifices, shared opportunities, shared returns on those investments, that in fact exactly what you're proposing, and I didn't get to any of the other stuff, student loans, Pell Grants, any of it, we are in fact
time's expired.
a disaster using your budget
Again,
blueprint.
Mr. Bergman is
Thank you,
recognized
Mr.
for
Chairman.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Director Mulvaney, thanks to you and President Trump for all the hard work in crafting the FY18 budget proposal. I'm encouraged by the strong conservative reforms the President has proposed and the consideration shown for our tax dollars. As a freshman member of the Budget Committee, one of the most interesting documents I read, it was about 26 pages, it was called The Evolution of Federal Budgeting. I've subtitled that, When 2 and 2 Ceased to Equal 4. We've got challenges, and we've heard it in different ways. As a career member of the military, I'm encouraged by the investments made in our national security and the military in general. I applaud the President for taking our national security threats seriously and for responding in a serious way. But I would suggest to you that this is not a plus-up of the military, it's a catch-up over the last 8 years. So I just have one question that I would like to discuss or hear your thoughts on this afternoon, and it regards Overseas Contingency Operations, or OCO as we call it. The President's budget slowly brings down OCO spending. Could you explain briefly the rationale behind the reduction, and in your opinion, would the administration support establishing a set of criteria, prioritized criteria, for allocating OCO dollars in the future to ensure that the money that is being spent is actually being spent on security needs, and to ensure we don't allocating more than necessary into the OCO account in future years?
We've not had a chance to talk about that in particular, Congressman, but I can assure you that I welcome that conversation. Simply haven't had a chance to do it yet because we've been working budget since the day I got there. But I share your concerns, as I mentioned with one of our colleagues earlier today, that OCO be used for OCO, and that it not be used in other ways because of the nature of the account, where it's not quite as accountable, it's not quite as transparent. It's not in anybody's benefit to use it as a place to park other spending. It is an important piece of how we operate the Defense Department, a necessary piece of how we operate the Defense Department, but it does need to be properly used.
So, thank you. And this is something we haven't heard much this morning. I yield back the balance of my time.
And you won't hear that much in this committee, Mr. Congressman.
I thank the gentleman. I see that we have no more speakers, at least at the present time, on the Democratic side, so we'll continue on the Republican side with Mr. Grothman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. From coming all over here, glad to see you on that side. Dream come true. Right now, the average debt per person, as you pointed out, in this country is about $60,000. I know there's going to be a difficult next 4 or 5 months for us all, because there are a lot of people, both on the Democratic side and I guess what I'll refer to as the Bush Republicans, who feel that $60,000 can get higher. But I'd like to thank you for trying to hold the line on 60, and in this budget over the next couple of years, how much higher do you think that's going to get, or do you think we can kind of hold it at 60 for now, or do you expect by the end of this year it's going to be up to 63, 64?
Well, it depends, Congressman, on what sort of assumptions we make about what y'all do. I mean, keep in mind, our budget is a message document. It contains the vision of the administration. Y'all control the power of the purse. So when it comes to spending, that will fall to you. I think the CBO baseline number has us adding $9 trillion of debt in the next 8 years. If you allow that to happen by not changing the current law, that's exactly what's going to happen.
Okay. I know you have a little bit more in here for border enforcement. Do you plan on, in the next year, doing a lot of work towards building the wall?
Yes, sir, we do. We ask for an additional plus up at the Department of Homeland Security of $4.5 billion, of which 2.6 will go to actual border security.
And how much of the wall do you think will build, first of all, by the end of our current fiscal year, and then beginning the year that we're talking about in this budget? How many miles do you plan on building?
It's really difficult to say for a couple of reasons. I'm not trying to dodge the question, I'm just trying to give you the variables that we deal with. We haven't picked the ideal kind of fence yet. We're going through a prototype process where there's a bunch of folks trying to build small sections of wall to sort of see what they look like, see how they might function. And then we've not decided if one size fits all on a wall or if different parts of the border need different types of barriers. So
what's your goal? You must have a goal.
The goal is securing the border.
I know. On October 1st of this year, how many miles, if I tell my constituents back home, if I have a town hall meeting?
Y'all appropriated 700,000? $341 million in the 17 appropriations bill for replacement, and we plan on spending all of that money this year.
Okay. You have no idea, guess 100 miles, 500 miles?
Mr.
No idea.
Again, it depends on the kind of wall that you build. I think the bollard wall is roughed out at $8 million a mile, but I think that's an all-in cost, and I think it's actually cheaper to do it when you replace wall that's there already because you already own the land, the infrastructure is there. So it's very difficult to give you that number, sir, and I apologize. We can give you our best estimates, though, in writing after the meeting.
Why don't you come back and give me an estimate as to when we're going to start building it and how many miles we'll get at the end of this fiscal year?
Work is going on today. I mean, work is going on the southern border today.
Good. Okay. Next question. I think your increased border enforcement will result in a savings, but I wondered if you could work towards, in 3 areas, work towards the amount of savings we could get if we kept certain immigrants here we wouldn't want here. And I'm thinking of 3 areas. I'm thinking crime, because we all have heard about stories about crimes committing to people who broke the law to get here. Welfare payments, even though they shouldn't be getting welfare payments, and providing medical care for expensive illegal immigrants coming here. Do you have any numbers on all 3, how much savings we could have in all 3 areas?
I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, Congressman, but I can tell you that the budget does provide or propose that we require Social Security numbers for recipients of both the child care tax credit and the earned income tax credit, which we think will result in dramatic savings.
I hear from my social workers or income maintenance workers sometimes because they're sanctuary cities or sanctuary counties, they're not able to ask questions, but that people are just taking advantage of our general income support programs, low-income housing, food share that are here illegally. Can we do anything to crack down on those people?
Yeah, we also propose, Congressman, as part of the policies contained in the budget, switching from the current lottery system to a merit-based system to assure that folks who come here can actually contribute more quickly to economic growth.
I'm glad you're working in that regard. One of the things that I've been trying to do since I've been here is do something about the marriage penalty, in which it apparently is the current policy of the American government to discourage parents of children from getting married. You know, it's not hard to think of a hypothetical $20,000, $30,000 a year, certainly $20,000 a year for not getting married. I don't see anything specifically dealing with that problem here. Would you be willing to work with Congress as we work our way through the system to try to not pace people so much not to get married?
Yes, sir. We'll be happy to do that because we agree with the principles.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentlemen's time has expired. Continuing with questions on this side of the dais, Mr. Smith from Missouri, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director, it's a pleasure to have you here. When I am home and talking about the budget to our constituents, they've never seen $1 trillion. And so the best way to talk about the fiscal situation of the federal government is to take off 8 zeros. when I talk to them. And you could take off those 8 zeros right now, and I put it in perspective that the folks back home make roughly $36,320 a year, give or take a little bit. That's the revenue that comes into the United States in this past year, roughly, estimated. But yet, that same individual would be spending $42,680 a year, almost $6,000 more a year. But wait, you add the 8 zeros, which is the federal government, and that's a whole lot more than $6,000. But when we talk to the people back home, it's you make $36,000, you spend $42,000, but yet on your credit card you have $190,000. It's unsustainable, as you know, as the president knows, and that's why I want to thank you and thank President Trump for offering a solution that comes towards a balanced budget in 10 years. So then we are at that point that you make $36,000 and you spend only $36,000, and then you can stop reducing the debt. Do you have the numbers of where we would be if we leave it as a status quo of how much the debt would be over the next 10 years?
And I think the 10-year number is, I think the 8-year number is $9 trillion, according to the baseline. If you leave status quo, if we simply go home and don't do anything different for the next 8 years, I think it's $9 trillion. Maybe it's $9 trillion versus 10 years, but roughly $9 trillion to answer your question.
So $9 trillion not to do anything. But if we pass this president's budget, we would add $5 trillion?
Yeah, I think it's half that, because we actually get to balance in the 10th year as a $16 billion surplus, I think.
Okay. Is there any items that you feel like that would be great that you would love to express that you may have been cut off in prior testimony that might be helpful?
No, I have to admire the way that you articulate the numbers, because I think what's so frustrating, we talked earlier today about regular language, regular English versus Washingtonian English, and at some point, Congressman, I wish we just didn't have the word trillion. I can't tell you the number of times I've asked folks that I used to represent, what do you think is more, $952 million or $1.1 trillion? And some people actually think 952 is more. It's 1,000 times different. It's actually more than 1,000 times different. And so you are right to get it down into numbers that people can understand. I don't like using $1 trillion or OMB because I've never seen $1 trillion either. I had a constituent one time give me a calculator that actually could do trillions of dollars of it. It's about this big. And it will absolutely frustrate you. I think you're doing absolutely the right thing, trying to explain to people what the real world looks like, because that credit card debt that you mentioned, the $190,000, is absolutely right. And they know what it would mean for their families if their families had that kind of debt. And it's not mortgage debt, as you pointed out. It's credit card debt, which is entirely different.
It's unsecured. Thank you, Director. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Alabama. Mr. Palmer is recognized for 5 minutes.
Good to see you, Director Mulvaney. I want to go back to a question that was asked by one of our colleagues. Did one of our colleagues on the other side say that she had never seen economic growth of 3%?
No, I think she said that what I was proposing was never before seen growth.
I would like to enter the record this document that shows that our average growth since for the last 7 years has been 3.21%.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask you a few questions and try to go through this fairly quickly. In your budget, you show $142 billion over the next 10 years in reductions in improper payments. I want to know why so little when last year the improper payments alone was 133.7.
No, thank you. We never had a chance to talk about that yet. That was a conscious decision. We only took 10% of the improper payments. We didn't want to be accused of using different numbers, so we tried to be as conservative as possible. I think it would have been reasonable for us to go as high as 40 or 50% in that. I think that's a goal that you should shoot for.
I think it would be reasonable, and I would like to have the opportunity to help you with that.
And keep in mind, if we do what the budget suggests and we get to that 40 or 50%, that's just a faster path to balance.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Let me ask you this: how does the administration define success when it comes to social programs? Do you consider adding more people to the welfare rolls as success? That's
No,
a yes
and
or
it's
no?
so frustrating to me when I see incentives at the state level to get people onto programs. That's not how you decide. That's not how you measure success. Success should be somebody who was employed, became unemployed, used the benefits available to him or her, whether it's unemployment, SNAP, whatever, as the bridge to get to the next job, gets back into the workforce, back in charge of their own life, back providing for their own family. That's what the safety net is for. That's what it needs to be for, and it needs to provide that type of comfort, but it can't be a permanent dependency.
So you're aware that when the government puts people on support that really shouldn't be there, that it disadvantages people who should be on there. For instance, there's a report out of the Illinois Department of Human Services that indicated they were giving preference to the able-bodied working-age adults because they were in the Medicaid expansion that resulted in thousands of people at the lower reimbursement rate being having to wait for care. And as a matter of fact, 752 died between 2013 and 2016. That's a bad policy. Wouldn't you agree with that?
It is. The people who pay the highest price for the abuse within the safety net are the folks who really should be on and need the safety net.
Well, let me ask you this. My Democrat colleagues cast many of the things that are in this budget as cuts when, in fact, they should really be talking about savings. For instance, eliminating LIHEAP payments to dead people, wouldn't that be a savings and not a cut?
Last time I checked, that would be a savings. Yes, sir.
When an able-bodied person who's working age that doesn't have young children is encouraged to get a job in order to continue to get Medicaid or food stamps or some other government program, and that able-bodied person actually improves the quality of their life, they raise their income, and they get off of government support, is that a savings or a cut?
That is a win for that person and that person's family, and a win for the country, and we should claim it as such.
Well, as a person who grew up pretty much dirt poor, I can tell you that work is the right path. I can tell you that from personal experience. Let me ask you something else.
I would suggest to you, Congressman, it's probably the only path.
It is the only path. Let me ask you something else in regard to the tax reform. I also have a chart here that indicates that a high tax burden damages economic growth, and it's particularly damaging to small business. Everybody gets caught up in the big corporations, but the employment engine of our economy is small business. And over the last 8 years, we've really seen that damage in full-blown, livid color. Gallup put out a report that indicated that prior to 2008, we had 100,000 more businesses starting up than closing. But by 2014, we had 70,000 more businesses closing than starting up. It's a disaster for employment in the United States. Can you briefly tell us how you think the tax reform policies will
it's
change that
the
trajectory?
dynamism in the market you're talking about. New business formation is at embarrassingly low levels, and we believe that tax policy certainly has an impact on that. We also actually believe that regulatory policy has more of an influence over that than even tax policy. I've started a small business. I've started a restaurant. I want to tell you that figuring out how to handle all the regulatory requirements was harder than rolling a burrito. So, I mean, business people want to be in business. They don't want to be in the business of filling out government paperwork.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to address the chair for a moment. I think it's wonderful. While I don't agree with everything that's in the president's proposed budget, I think it's wonderful that we have a budget director that supports a pro-growth economy, that supports small business formation, and supports getting people back to work. I yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. Thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just find it ludicrous that Democrats in this hearing have suggested that President Trump has betrayed his voters by presenting a balanced budget. And so, Director Mulvaney, please share with the President that the folks in Florida's 1st Congressional District who voted for the President are proud of the fact that you have worked so hard to bring a balanced budget forward for our consideration and review. I honestly wish that we could vote out the President's budget today and make it the law and use it as a device to constrain the growth of government. I don't want to see the swamp of this town submerge and swallow up the bold decisions that you and the President have made together to put us on a path to fiscal responsibility. My question for you, Director, is this. Detail for us the ideas that Democrats on the Budget Committee have brought to your office to balance the budget?
It's none.
Is it safe then to assume that a balanced budget is not truly a priority or an objective of those who've been asking you these questions today?
You could certainly assume from the experience on this committee, for example, over the last 8 years, that since the previous administration never offered a balanced budget, that administration, representing their party, are not interested in balancing the budget.
I want to speak for a moment about work requirements. This committee, in the context of health care, took the position that able-bodied, childless adults should have to meet a work requirement if they want someone else to pay for their health care. What's the position of the President in this budget relative to work requirements?
Actually, we support that both within the American Health Care Act, which we support and that y'all have already voted on. We also take that same sentiment and apply it to food stamps, under the theory that if you are an able-bodied person with no dependents and you're able to work, we should require you to prove that you're trying to work in order to get food stamps.
Should that be a mandatory requirement within these federal programs that we have work requirements, or should states be able to choose whether or not to have work requirements?
Well, both is the answer to your question. I think in the AHCA, we allow the states to do it because I think that deals with Medicaid, which is a state-administered program. In our budget, we introduced that concept into SNAP, which is, I believe, it's a federally run program. I'm sure the states are involved in providing the services, but I think we're a lot heavier involved in food stamps.
And if you tell folks in the food stamp space, the SNAP space, in the Medicaid space, that the path to greater progress is not further dependence on the government, it's actually getting the benefit of work, what impact do you think that will have on our aspirations for broader economic growth?
In order to get that 3% growth, we need folks to work, okay? And we need to figure out a way to provide them with the economic opportunity so that they can go to work. I didn't get a chance to talk here today about the difference between the U3 measure of unemployment and the U6 measure. U3 is the measure that we use most traditionally. It's folks who are defined as being in the workforce but unable to find work. U6 is those people plus folks who are, I think we describe it as marginally attached or working part-time for economic reasons against their will. Okay? That difference is, I think, over 6 million people. Those are folks who want to work full-time but haven't found the opportunity to do that yet. That's the folks we want to go to and say, look, if we can get to 3% growth, we can get you into the full-time job that you want.
Director Mulvaney, please also share with the President the gratitude from the folks in my district who are so grateful to see a President willing to prioritize our military and the capabilities within our military to meet the challenges presented by our adversaries. As a member of the Armed Services Committee, I've seen time and again our adversaries invest in next-generation weapon systems, testing, evaluation, and so maybe could you speak to the opportunities that would be presented for our military and our capabilities in the test and evaluation mission if we were to accept the budget that you and the President have proposed?
Yeah, and I think if you encouraged to, I'll have you reach out to Secretary Mattis. But what I think you'd hear him say is he wants this money now so that he can modernize and get readiness up to where it needs to be. That's his first priority, is taking what we already have and making sure it is able to be used to defend the nation. We are all interested longer term in looking at larger troop numbers, larger ship numbers, larger plane numbers, but his first priority is making sure the defense capabilities we have can be used if necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Mulvaney, for your service to our country in the House and now in your new role with the President. Growing up in Plainview, Texas, my dad said that money didn't grow on trees, and I believed him until I came to Washington. And now I've got to tell him I found the money tree, and it's the United States Treasury. And I'm just grateful that you're presenting a budget that's not a money tree trimming budget, but it's a money tree cutting budget. And that's what we've got to do if we're going to get our country back. I want to applaud you and the President for proposing a long overdue balanced budget, and one that begins reducing our national debt, which I believe is the greatest threat to my children's future in this great country. And we know what to do.
You know what to do. I know what to do. The committee knows what to do. The American people know what we have to do. They're waiting on politicians to have the courage to do it. I commend you on your courage, and I commend the president equally. I agree with your growth projections. I think there's pent-up growth demand in this country. If we will just unleash it, unleash the economy, unshackle it from the $2 trillion in regulatory costs, the highest corporate income tax in the industrialized world, and relieve the American people, middle class and working class families, from this disaster called Obamacare. We're not going to agree on every item in the budget. You know that. I know that. Let me highlight for you what is, I think now after Ms. Delbaney has expressed her thoughts, a bipartisan concern, with all due respect. Our food, fuel, and fiber producers in rural America are feeding and clothing the American people, and they are fueling the American economy. That's not just economic development for West Texas. That's ag and energy independence for the entire nation. That is national security for every American citizen. Now, I've got a question, and I'll qualify it with 4 very important facts. Agriculture is the basis for the economy in rural America. In the last farm bill, we cut billions of dollars from farm programs. The last 3 years, we saw a 50% decline in farm income, the steepest decline since the Great Depression. And you know this, Director Mulvaney, but farm policies represent a mere 0.26% of the entire federal budget. Here's my question. Recognizing that we need to make cuts, recognizing there are cuts to be made everywhere, why now, and why such deep cuts to our farm sector safety net?
Thank you, Congressman. As I mentioned earlier, and I can't put my hands on my piece of paper, there's actually, I think we dramatically increase spending on some ag programs, not the least of which I think is the farm loan program. We've also, as I'm sure you have, listened to farmers to find out what their priorities are, what can allow them to change that trend you talked about in terms of farm incomes. And what we hear from them again and again and again is more favorable trade deals, because the world is their market and the world needs to be their market, and we need to be able to ship U.S.-grown agricultural products everywhere, and right now we lack the ability to do that. That's why I applaud the President, as I'm sure you do, being from West Texas, over even the incremental benefits we've been able to get with the Chinese in terms of our meat exports. It's a big deal for our folks back home. Tremendous. I was from a rural district as well. You look then at the regulatory climate and what we were doing to our farmers in terms of waters of the U.S. and clean streams and regulations from top to bottom. Farmers are farmers, and they want to grow stuff, and they want to be productive. They don't want to be paper pushers who try and figure out how the federal government is going to punish them for doing something that they thought was right. So we hear those farmers again and again. They're down at the White House on a regular basis. To your point, I won't be Pollyannish. Yes, we do make some proposed changes in some of the farm programs. I think we deal with, well, let me put it this way. We focused exclusively on what we would call corporate farmers, protecting, I think, 96% of farms in this country.
If I may, just because I have just a little time.
Yes, sir.
We need freer markets, as you suggested. We need fair trade, better trade deals, as the President has suggested. They'll never be able to compete, though, with China and India and others that don't have an EPA, they don't have an OSHA, they don't have these costs. So we need a safety net, a reliable, strong safety net. I yield back. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, sir.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Gentleman's time is expired. Let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Yarmouth, for closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mick, thanks so much for being here. Just for the record, as you know, when I was alerted that you were a possible appointee for this position, I wrote a note to the transition team saying that I consider Mick Mulvaney a man of the highest character, principle, and intelligence, and one with whom I agree on almost nothing. But that as ranking member on the Budget Committee, that I know we would have an amicable working relationship and a mutually respectful one. And I haven't changed my opinion about any of that. Thank you so much for your work and your appearance, and I look forward to
if
discussions
I may,
as we go
Congressman,
along.
I want you to know that I have protected that secret with my life over the course of the last several months, so I'm glad that you were the one to out that and not me.
Absolutely.
But I do appreciate those words and also your efforts during the transition process.
Thanks. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Secrets. I'm going to use my closing, Director Mulvaney, to clean up some of the record, if I could, or establish more of the record. I don't think we've talked much about the debt ceiling concept, and I know you were worried we wouldn't get to that. So let me ask a few questions in that regard. Of course, the statutory debt limit was reinstated on March 16, 2017 at just under $19.809 trillion. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin at that time informed Speaker Ryan that beginning that day, the outstanding debt of the United States would be at the statutory limit immediately, and that he would begin using quote-unquote extraordinary measures to temporarily continue to meet all the federal government's financial obligations. Mnuchin also wrote that he was declaring a, quote, debt issuance suspension period, or DISP, to allow him to use additional extraordinary measures to extend the debt limit, and that's something his predecessors have declared under similar circumstances, you remember as well. He encouraged the Congress to protect the full faith and credit of the United States by acting to increase the statutory debt limit as soon as possible. So the two questions, I guess, would be, does the administration have a preferred legislative approach to the debt limit issue? For example, specific amount or specific time period? And then secondly, how soon do you think we need to act?
Thank you for that. Very briefly, the answer to your first question is no, we do not have a final stated policy yet. I can tell you that I met for about an hour yesterday with Secretary Mnuchin to discuss this exact topic. We look forward to Director Cohn, who is the third person of the troika, so to speak, that sort of lead on economic issues within the West Wing, or within the White House, returning from overseas so we can continue that conversation. We look forward to working with the Hill on the best way to go about that. Secondly, regarding the timing, my understanding is that the receipts currently are coming in a little bit slower than expected, and you may soon hear from Mr. Mnuchin regarding a change in the date.
Okay. I thank the gentleman for coming again. Let me add my appreciation for what you're doing. I thank the President for prioritizing as he's done in this budget, and I appreciate the respect he's given us to do our Article 1 duty. I think, Mick, the President is lucky to have you, the administration is lucky to have you, and indeed the country is lucky to have you in this position. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Todd. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. With that, this meeting is adjourned.